The early August heat of 2015 began with an unusual disturbance on the dirt road leading into Broken Bow, Nebraska. Four unmarked police cars quietly pulled up in front of a small, weathered wooden house, isolated amid the vast prairie that seemed to stretch endlessly. Neighbors peeked through curtains as officers in tactical gear silently positioned themselves around the area, moving slowly and deliberately across the dry gravel. Inside, Evan Halberg, 54 years old, was preparing his morning coffee, a routine he had maintained for years as an amateur photographer, living quietly, almost invisibly, within the community. A rapid knock came at 6:31 a.m. Evan Halberg, Hall County Sheriff's Department. "We have a warrant for your arrest in connection with the 2003 disappearance of Mara Ellison." Officers later described the man's hand trembling slightly as he set the mug down, yet his face remained eerily calm and composed, as though he had been waiting for this moment for the past 12 long years. Before diving deeper into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the latest cases. The summer of 2003 in Grand Island, Nebraska, unfolded with the characteristic rhythm of the Midwest, peaceful, slow-paced, and filled with outdoor community activities. Against this backdrop, an amateur photography shoot at the Nebraska State Fairgrounds drew dozens of young people, including Mara Ellison, 19 years old, a part-time barista at a local coffee shop, and an enthusiastic amateur model. She attended nearly every open shoot in the area, hoping to build her personal portfolio. Also present that day were three other young models, Jenna Moyer, Kayla Bricks, and Lacey Dorn. They were casually acquainted with Mara and often crossed paths at similar events, where numerous amateur photographers gathered to experiment with techniques, equipment, and new styles. Among the regular attendees at these open shoots was Evan Halberg, a middle-aged man who always carried film cameras and an old, worn equipment bag, a familiar face. He typically appeared friendly, soft-spoken but patient, and had repeatedly offered to help with post-processing photos for the young models. That day the weather was clear, with sunlight lingering well into the late afternoon, providing ideal conditions for small groups to spread out across various areas of the fairgrounds to test natural lighting setups. Mara began the shoot with Jenna, Kayla, and Lacey, moving between wooden structures, open fields, and old fences. Everything followed a familiar rhythm, posing, changing positions, taking breaks in the shade. Evan appeared midway through the session, observing for a long while before approaching Mara's group. He suggested trying some individual shots, and since this was not unusual at previous events, Mara agreed to step away from the group briefly. Toward the end of the afternoon, as the sunlight softened, most participants began packing up their gear to leave. Jenna, Kayla, and Lacey saw Mara standing next to Evan near the west parking area of the fairgrounds. There was nothing out of the ordinary, just the two of them talking while Evan opened his truck bed to store equipment. According to the recorded observations, Mara left the fairgrounds with Evan around 4:50 p.m., both getting into his familiar silver-gray pickup truck. At 5:02 p.m., a passerby on Alder Road reported seeing a girl, matching Mara's description, standing beside Evan's truck at a narrow turn, a few miles from the fairgrounds. This was the last time anyone saw her. That evening, Mara did not return home. Her family initially assumed she might be staying with a friend or delayed by something unexpected, but as the night deepened with no calls or messages, worry mounted quickly. Repeated calls to Mara's phone went unanswered. The family tried contacting her friends, but no one knew where she was or what her plans were after the shoot. At 2:14 a.m. the following day, after hours of waiting and no longer able to search on their own, the family officially reported Mara Ellison missing to the Hall County Sheriff's Department. The missing person report from Mara Ellison's family was received by Hall County Dispatch at 2:15 a.m., triggering the protocol for handling an unusual absence of an adult under 2003 standards. Initial data indicated that Mara was last seen the previous afternoon, with no contact from her for several consecutive hours, enough for the shift to classify the case as one requiring immediate follow-up rather than passive observation. A patrol unit was dispatched to the location provided by the family, the section of Alder Road where Mara's vehicle was last seen. Upon arrival, Officers confirmed that Mara's light blue sedan was parked partially on the shoulder, with no signs of collision or external impact. The doors were still locked, showing no evidence of forced entry, and the surrounding area was quiet, covered in a thin layer of dust, typical of a low-traffic rural road at night. The patrol unit established the last known point based on the vehicle's position and confirmed this as the final verifiable piece of evidence regarding Mara's presence. Aside from witness statements, no notable personal items were visible outside the car, and the dry nighttime conditions made it easier to document tire marks, footprints, or any ground disturbance. Some faint impressions appeared on the dirt near the shoulder, but they could not be attributed to anyone specific or dated precisely, as the area commonly saw vehicles stopping briefly or locals walking for exercise in the evenings. During scene documentation, dispatch coordinated further with the family to confirm when Mara left home that morning, her daily schedule, and any planned stops. Information about the photography event at the fairgrounds and Mara leaving with Evan was quickly added to the report, helping investigators visualize the possible sequence of movements leading to the car's appearance on Alder Road. However, at this stage, the only required task was to assess the scene's status and accurately record the vehicle's position. No in-depth analysis or evidence collection was conducted, as there was insufficient basis to presume criminal activity. Under Nebraska's 2003 risk assessment guidelines, an adult going temporarily out of contact was not automatically deemed an emergency unless evidence indicated immediate danger. Nevertheless, Mara's lack of history of running away, her failure to respond to contacts, and the vehicle's location not aligning with her route home prompted the shift to elevate the case to concern elevated, requiring expanded police checks during overnight hours rather than waiting until morning. After completing documentation around the vehicle, the patrol unit concluded the narrow radius sweep around the LKP without finding any direct trace of Mara Ellison. The absence of personal items or signs of struggle within a 300-meter radius made the possibility that Mara left the vehicle voluntarily or departed the area by other means a hypothesis that required serious consideration. Potential travel routes were marked and incorporated into the initial search map, but given the lack of on-scene leads, the investigation's focus had to shift back to the starting point of the event chain, where Mara was last seen active and engaged in clear social interaction. Early that same morning, the Hall County investigative team redirected efforts to the Nebraska State Fairgrounds, identifying it as the critical link to reconstruct Mara's final hours before appearing on Alder Road. At the fairgrounds, police began collecting statements from the list of event participants, prioritizing those who had direct interaction with Mara that afternoon. Thanks to the organizer-provided roster, witness outreach was conducted systematically, following the timeline of departures. Among the initial statements, Jenna Moyer, Kayla Bricks, and Lacey Dorn were identified as key witnesses since they had been with Mara for most of her time at the fairgrounds. All three confirmed that Mara arrived around 2:30 p.m., quickly joined the shoot, and showed no unusual signs in mood or behavior while they were together. Others described Mara actively participating in various photo sets, with no signs of conflict or argument with anyone. Police noted that no internal incidents occurred at the event, no reported disputes, equipment accidents, or noteworthy behavior involving Mara. While compiling statements, investigators quickly noticed the repeated prominence of one individual, a middle-aged photographer who moved between model groups during the shoot. Many referred to him as Evan Halberg, or Mr. Evan with the film camera, as he was one of the few still using film rather than the increasingly common digital cameras in 2003. Witness descriptions of Evan were consistent: around 50 years old, thin build, long gray hair reaching his neck, wearing a khaki jacket, and carrying a dark brown equipment bag. Some attendees noted that Evan often shot individual angles and rarely mingled with the larger crowds of photographers. When asked about interactions between Evan and Mara, multiple statements confirmed that he paid noticeably focused attention to Mara that afternoon. Witnesses said Evan arrived later than most, around 3:40 p.m., but after observing for a few minutes, he approached Mara's group and offered to take some solo frames. This was not seen as unusual, as many photographers, at open shoots, tended to isolate models for individual practice shots. The investigative team constructed a detailed timeline based on the repeatedly mentioned time markers in the statements. Mara was first seen at 2:35 p.m. in the eastern wooden structure area of the fairgrounds, shooting group photos with Jenna and Kayla. Lacey joined about 20 minutes later, adding observations of Mara continually changing positions per photographer's suggestions. From 3 p.m. to 3:30 p.m., Mara and the group moved to the old fence area, a spot popular among models for its beautiful light. This was when they began noticing Evan's presence, standing a short distance away, watching and constantly adjusting his film camera. Around 3:50 p.m., Evan approached and suggested a few solo portrait shots with Mara. All three key witnesses confirmed Mara appeared comfortable and agreed, having photographed with him at a small event a few months earlier. From 4 p.m. to 4:30 p.m., witnesses noted Evan and Mara moving to the western open field area, less crowded than the rest of the event. Statements aligned that this was the longest period Mara was separated from the group during the shoot. After 4:30 p.m., most participants began packing up to leave the fairgrounds. During this phase, only a few stayed longer, including Jenna and a photographer named Clark, who confirmed seeing Evan talking with Mara near the west parking area. This detail became critical as it was the last time anyone at the event saw Mara before she departed. Based on the compiled statements, police verified the departure sequence. Evan closed the truck bed. Mara stood to the right of the pickup, exchanged brief words with him. Then both got in around 4:50 p.m. No one saw Mara return to the fairgrounds after that time. Comparing the statement timelines with the Alda Road witness report, investigators confirmed that the last person seen with Mara was Evan Halberg, and the window from 4:50 p.m. to 5:02 p.m. represented the travel from the fairgrounds to the location where an independent witness saw Mara beside Evan's truck. All this data was consolidated into a seamless timeline, clearly linking each time marker to specific statements, ensuring no informational gaps throughout the afternoon of the event. After completing witness collection at the fairgrounds and clearly establishing that Evan Halberg was the last person seen with Mara Ellison before she appeared on Alda Road, the investigative team decided to approach him at his residence later that morning. Evan's address was on the northern outskirts of Grand Island, in a quiet residential area with sparse housing and low traffic, matching the description many event witnesses had provided. When police arrived, Evan was in the backyard, apparently cleaning some photography equipment. He was cooperative, not surprised by law enforcement's appearance, and agreed to step inside for discussion. During the interview, police asked Evan to recount his activities on the day of the event. Evan stated he arrived at the fairgrounds around 4 p.m., stayed to shoot for about an hour, then left to process film at home, after which he rested and did not leave again that evening. When asked about his interaction with Mara, Evan admitted to taking a few solo photos of her, but denied leaving the event with her, insisting he departed the fairgrounds alone. This statement immediately conflicted with fairgrounds witnesses and the independent Alda Road sighting of Mara beside Evan's truck. When police pressed for more detail on the time from leaving the event to arriving home, Evan offered a loose estimate of around 5 p.m. or a little after, but could provide no supporting evidence, such as receipts, phone calls, or third-party corroboration. This created a clear 1-2 hour gap that investigators had already identified, overlapping precisely with the time of Mara's last sighting. Police further inquired about his route from the fairgrounds to home, but Evan's responses made the timeline even vaguer. He mentioned taking a southern loop through the city to avoid traffic, yet this route did not align with the direction to Alda Road, and his stated timing did not match actual late-afternoon traffic patterns. When asked if he stopped anywhere else, Evan said he might have paused a minute or two to check equipment, but could not recall the exact location. His slow, detail-lacking responses, frequently returning to "I'm not sure," led police to note this as potential evasion rather than mere memory lapse. Nevertheless, at this point, Evan's statement, though inconsistent with witnesses, could not yet be considered evidence establishing criminal conduct. He retained the right to withhold further information, and police lacked legal grounds to search equipment, vehicles, or restrict his movement. The investigative team documented Evan's demeanor during the interview, formally cooperative, providing answers but lacking specificity, attempting to tie the timeline to unverified or non-existent events. From this, Evans' initial file was updated, officially classifying him as a person of interest, an individual directly linked to the disappearances sequence and requiring monitoring in subsequent investigation phases. However, per 2003 legal regulations, this did not equate to grounds for detention or liberty restriction, as no evidence yet proved Mara was endangered due to him. At the conclusion of the interview, police left Evans' residence with more information, but no closer to locating Mara. His statement created an unexplained time gap that aligned with the most critical period in the event chain. These facts were immediately entered into the internal report, strengthening the basis for the investigative team to proceed to the next analytical steps, focusing on re-examining routes, departure timing, and the credibility of Evans' provided account. Immediately following the initial contact with Evan Halberg and the clear determination that his statement did not match verified timelines, the investigative team returned to Alder Road to launch the first ground search operation. Based on the assumption that if Mara left the fairgrounds with Evan and was seen beside his vehicle around 5:02 p.m., the surrounding area of that road segment was a critical zone requiring immediate sweep before environmental traces could degrade. Search Operation #1 was authorized the following morning, mobilizing Hall County's ground search team, along with 2 K-9 units trained for missing persons detection. The search pattern applied was an expanding spiral, starting from Mara's vehicle location, the potential second last known point after the fairgrounds. From the spiral's center, the team advanced in predefined distance layers, ensuring no area within the initial 300-meter radius was missed. Deployment timing was favorable. Dry weather, no overnight rain, and soft ground impressions retained basic structure, aiding K-9 detection of any lingering unusual scents. The 2 K-9 SED were worked on long leads to sweep simultaneously in 2 directions, one along the northern shoulder, where small footpaths led into gaps between trees, the other southward, where open terrain was blocked by tall grass and trails leading to open fields. Rescue personnel followed the K-9 SEDs, marking swept areas with reflective stakes to prevent overlap. During this process, officers closely examined the roadway, roadside verges, and points likely used for stopping the previous afternoon. Impressions recorded the night before remained intact, but formed no logical movement sequence, suggesting they could belong to vehicles stopping there over multiple days. No skid marks, struggle signs, or ground disturbances directly linked to Mara exiting the vehicle or being dragged away were found. The team also checked low mounds and dense grass near the shoulder, areas prone to concealing small items or wind-displaced traces. A few pieces of household litter were noted, food wrappers, bottle caps, but all appeared too old or unrelated to the disappearance time frame. Over the next 2 hours, the search expanded to 500 meters, focusing on secondary dirt turnouts commonly used by pickup trucks for turning or pausing. At one dirt section about 420 meters north of Mara's vehicle, a compacted soil cluster was found, but close inspection revealed it as an old, sun-hardened tire track, undated and unrelated to the current case. Meanwhile, the K-9 SED showed no strong alerts at any point, briefly pausing at locations with animal scents or faded human traces, but giving no target confirmation. The team continued sweeping near the tree line, where morning sidelight clearly illuminated the ground and flattened grass. However, the uniform grass structure showed no signs of recent pedestrian passage or dragged objects within the past 24 hours. Small puddles along ditches also lacked fresh footprints or shoe impressions. As the search radius exceeded 700 meters, the terrain opened into agricultural fields, too vast for efficient visual searching, and no suspicious points were identified within the swept area. After nearly 4 continuous hours, the entire 1-kilometer radius around Alder Road was fully marked, with no indicators that Mara had left the vehicle on foot at this location. The preliminary report from Search Operation #1 concluded that no victim was located, no direct evidence related to the disappearance was found, and the area around the vehicle showed no signs of violence or resistance. These findings were entered into the case file, confirming that if Mara had been present at this location, she had departed the area by a means that left no ground traces within the initial search radius. After the search team completed the sweep around Alder Road, without finding any trace of Mara Ellison, the investigative team shifted focus to her vehicle, the only remaining physical element at the scene, and the point expected to potentially provide even the smallest clue. The vehicle examination was conducted according to forensic baseline protocol, meaning all scene data was collected at the most basic level before deciding whether to proceed with more in-depth specialized analysis. The car was sealed on site and then transported to a covered inspection area near the Hall County headquarters to avoid weather exposure and preserve any potential evidence. Upon initial approach, the technical team noted the overall condition. All 4 doors were locked, windows were not rolled down, the trunk was fully closed, and the body showed no scratches or unusual impact marks. This aligned with the initial assessment that the vehicle was not the site of direct violent activity. Inside the car, technicians began by photographing the entire interior from multiple angles to create an original record before any item was moved. All personal items were left in their original positions to ensure subsequent analysis could rely on the initial state. Mara's belongings included a thin folded jacket on the passenger seat, a half-full water bottle, a small purse containing her wallet, and a few basic items, and a pocket-sized notebook. Nothing was scattered or appeared to have been yanked out of place, indicating no struggle had occurred inside the vehicle. The investigative team proceeded to lift fingerprints from interior and exterior door handles, the dashboard, steering wheel, gear shift, and other frequently touched surfaces. Initial findings showed that most fingerprints on the vehicle belonged to Mara, consistent with her known records, and some unidentified prints, possibly from friends who had ridden in the car, or from maintenance personnel. Since there was no basis yet to link any specific print directly to the disappearance, all were preserved for later comparison. In addition to fingerprints, technicians collected fiber samples from the seats, floor, and areas near the rear door. These samples showed no signs of unusual synthetic fibers or pulled fabric, which are commonly present in cases of restraint or struggle in confined spaces. The collected fibers were mostly ordinary clothing fibers, with colors matching the outfit Mara was wearing on the day of the event. Soil sampling was conducted from the driver's footwell, passenger footwell, and door sills to determine whether anyone had entered the vehicle at a time or place inconsistent with Mara's use. The amount of soil recovered was minimal, mostly fine dust, with no traces of mud or damp earth adhering, as would be expected if someone had stepped in from outdoor terrain. This was particularly noteworthy because it strongly suggested no stranger had entered the vehicle after Mara's last known departure from the fairgrounds. The investigative team also noted that the car keys showed no signs of forced use or mechanical tampering. This reinforced the hypothesis that the vehicle was deliberately parked on Alder Road rather than abandoned following a coercive act. Upon closer inspection of the rear seat area, technicians found no indentations, scratches, or struggle marks. Seat belts remained neatly in place, with no belts yanked out suddenly or twisted in a manner indicative of resistance. Mara's purse inside the vehicle still contained all her identification, bank cards, and other personal items, ruling out robbery as a motive related to her disappearance. Mara's phone was not in the car, but it was entirely normal for a young woman to carry her phone on her person after an event, so this did not lead to any clear conclusion. The investigative team also carefully checked the dashboard and fuel gauge to assess possible travel before the vehicle was left behind. However, the fuel level showed nothing unusual, and there were no indications of sudden stopping or mechanical failure. Mara's departure from the vehicle, or being forced to leave it, left no trace of violence, making the car a clean crime scene in terms of behavior, yet still critically important as the final verified marker of her movement. At the conclusion of the examination, the forensic baseline report noted, no signs of struggle, no signs of coercion, no direct evidence indicating criminal activity had occurred inside the vehicle. The car only showed ordinary traces and did not point to any specific investigative direction. Nevertheless, this information confirmed that if anything happened to Mara, it most likely did not occur inside the vehicle, and the vehicle's appearance on Alder Road remained a key detail that needed to be placed within the context of subsequent search and timeline verification efforts. In the context of Mara Ellison's vehicle, providing no direct indication of how she left the vehicle. The investigative team turned to the remaining factor that could help determine Mara and Evan's direction of travel before 5:02 p.m., the road network around Alder Road and vehicle movement patterns along the I-80 corridor on the afternoon of the disappearance. Since 2003 lacked fixed traffic cameras along connecting routes to Grand Island, the investigative team had to rely entirely on statements from drivers who passed through the area during the relevant time frame, along with traffic maps from the period and potential short-term turnoff or stopping points. Patrol units were assigned to approach rest areas, gas stations, and roadside businesses along I-80 west and east of Grand Island, requesting employees and drivers to provide any recollections of Evan's gray pickup truck or the presence of a young woman matching Mara's description. The most notable case came from a long-haul truck driver who reported passing Alder Road between approximately 5:05 p.m. and seeing a girl standing next to a silver pickup at the narrow turn. However, this was the same witness statement already on record and provided no information about travel before or after that moment. When the list of drivers passing through the area from 4:30 p.m. to 5:30 p.m. was expanded, the investigative team obtained several inconsistent statements. One local driver said he saw a similar vehicle turn onto a northern side road off Alder Road around 4:55 p.m., but could not confirm who was inside. Another driver claimed to have seen a gray vehicle accelerate away from an I-80 exit heading west, though he would not confirm it was Evan's truck or merely a coincidence. A third driver provided conflicting information, stating he saw a same-colored vehicle pulled to the shoulder with hazard lights flashing as if preparing to turn around, but his recorded time was after 5:10 p.m., not aligning with the witness time of seeing Mara. When placed side by side, these statements did not form a consistent movement sequence. There was no visual evidence to verify whether the vehicles the drivers reported seeing were actually Evan's. Additionally, many vehicles in the area had similar paint colors, making subjective driver observations unreliable as confirmation. The absence of traffic cameras meant there was no way to trace images of Evan's pickup at any turnoff or route during the critical time window. Even locations that might have held footage, such as convenience stores or gas stations, did not retain data long-term. Most systems only stored video for 48 to 72 hours, and by the time police began reviewing, that window had already passed. With no visual means to verify the route, the investigative team shifted to geographic logic analysis. From the Alder Road location, a minor intersection but one that connected directly to several side roads, police constructed a movement possibility map, modeling the four main directions Evan's vehicle could have taken from the fairgrounds to the point where Mara's car was seen. Route 1 from the fairgrounds heading south on the main road, then turning west to join Alder Road. This was the shortest and most time-consistent route with the 12-minute gap between leaving the fairgrounds and the witness sighting of Mara. Route 2, looping through the western residential area of Grand Island before rejoining Alder Road via a side road. This route was longer but not ruled out if Evan intended to avoid traffic or test equipment. Route 3, heading south briefly in the opposite direction before turning around at an intersection. However, this was not time feasible, as it would have made it difficult for the vehicle to appear on Alder Road precisely at 5:02 p.m. Route 4, heading north through connecting dirt roads in the farming area, then joining Alder Road from a farther intersection. This was the hardest to verify, as the area had low traffic and no witnesses reported seeing Evan's vehicle in that direction. When analyzing these four routes in terms of timing, police determined that only routes 1 and 2 aligned with the witness-provided time data. However, due to the lack of objective confirmation, all four routes were retained on the movement possibility map. A key issue was that none of the collected driver statements had sufficient consistency to narrow the scope. Discrepancies in timing, vehicle direction, and description made cross-referencing nearly impossible. Some drivers recalled only vaguely, as there was no reason for them to pay close attention to the vehicle at the time. Others described from memory, influenced by the passage of time. The investigative team had to accept that the travel segment from the fairgrounds to Alder Road could not be accurately reconstructed, meaning no route could be eliminated and none could be confirmed as correct. The final report from this analysis phase concluded that the travel route of Mara and Evan between 4:50 p.m. and 5:02 p.m. remained undetermined. All statements carried significant margin of error, and no technological tools were available to verify. This prevented narrowing investigative directions, forcing the team to maintain the map of 4 movement possibility routes as a foundation for future review, while accepting that the route leaving the fairgrounds and the manner in which Mara's vehicle appeared on Alder Road remained an unresolved link. Parallel to the analysis of travel routes and the lack of strong leads to narrow the search area, the investigative team shifted toward personal factors to determine whether Mara Ellison's disappearance could be linked to social relationships or private issues unknown to her family. The goal of this step was to rule out voluntary departure, personal conflicts leading to avoidance behavior, or latent disputes that could serve as a motive for harm from an acquaintance. First, police interviewed Mara's family to check for common factors in voluntary missing persons cases, such as complicated romantic relationships, personal debts, family conflicts, or signs of psychological instability. Both parents and Mara's younger brother confirmed that she had shown no unusual changes in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Her part-time job at the coffee shop remained stable, her community college schedule continued regularly, and she displayed no signs of stress or avoidance of personal responsibilities. The family also stated that Mara had never left home overnight without notice, and her daily routine showed no plans involving leaving Grand Island. The investigative team next approached coworkers at the coffee shop, where Mara worked several shifts per week. Both the manager and coworkers described her as reliable, punctual, and conflict-free during shifts. Her work schedule during the week of the disappearance showed no requests for time off, no prior arguments, and no emotionally disruptive messages or calls received while at work. Some coworkers noted that Mara had shared plans to expand her photo portfolio to audition for advertising modeling roles in Omaha, but this reflected personal ambition rather than any intent to abruptly change her life. The investigative team also interviewed Mara's close friends, including 2 classmates, and a group of friends who frequently attended community events. No one reported Mara facing significant financial, romantic, or academic pressure. Her most recent gatherings were entirely normal. She did not mention wanting to leave her current environment, did not confide about being followed, and showed no anxiety related to any individual. Some friends further described Mara as being in a fairly positive phase, excited about photo shoots, and hopeful for more collaboration opportunities with new photographers. When expanding to neighbors in the area where Mara lived, police obtained similar results. No reports of family conflicts, no major arguments recently, no unusual appearances of strangers around the house. Neighbors living nearby confirmed that they regularly saw Mara jogging in the evenings, maintaining a steady routine and not associating with problematic groups. The investigative team placed particular emphasis on the possibility that Mara had been drawn into risky activities or secret relationships. However, throughout the interview process, no documents or statements indicated a double life or complicated romantic entanglements. Mara's personal phone, though not yet located, was confirmed by family to contain no suspicious contacts based on their recollection, and close friends were unaware of any new relationships. When analyzing all collected data, the investigative team found no internal motive suggesting Mara voluntarily disappeared or was harmed by an acquaintance. No one had reason to cause her harm, no prolonged conflicts existed, and no signs indicated she was threatened or in trouble with any specific group. This completely ruled out the investigative direction centered on personal relationships or family issues. From an operational perspective, the absence of motive from people within her known circle made Mara's disappearance inconsistent with patterns of cases tied to internal conflicts, which accounted for a high percentage of statistics at the time. The conclusion of this section's report stated clearly that Mara Ellison had no reason to voluntarily leave her living environment, had no personal conflict significant enough to lead to violence, and showed no signs of intentionally avoiding family. This strengthened the hypothesis that her disappearance did not originate from internal factors, forcing the investigative team to continue examining directions related to the behavior of individuals present at the photo shoot or those who interacted with her during her last recorded time period. At the point when all statements from Mara Ellison's friends and neighbors confirmed she had no reason to voluntarily leave her environment, the investigative team shifted primary focus to the only individual with direct contact with her during her final known time period, Evan Halberg. The inconsistencies in Evan's statements, particularly the unexplained time gap between leaving the fairgrounds and appearing on Alder Road, led the investigative team to conclude that the next step required stricter legal measures. Based on the recorded elements, Evan being the last person with Mara, an independent witness confirming their presence at the same location, and the inconsistency regarding the route, the investigative team prepared an application for a search warrant of his residence in accordance with 2003 procedures. The warrant was approved by the local magistrate based on the argument that items or documents related to Mara's disappearance could be held at Evan's private residence, and collection needed to occur promptly to prevent loss. That same afternoon, an investigative team consisting of 4 officers and 2 forensic technicians arrived at Evan's residence, a small isolated house on the northern outskirts of Grand Island, to execute the warrant. Evan was present when the team arrived. He appeared surprised but did not resist, and was asked to remain seated under supervision in the living room while police conducted the search within the warrant's scope. The review began in the workroom area, where Evan kept most of his photography equipment and items related to his hobby. On the desk were several old film cameras, detachable lenses, equipment bags, and cardboard boxes containing photographic materials. Witnesses at the event had described Evan using an older model film camera with worn coloring around the grip area, and the investigative team noted that among the equipment present was one that fully matched the description, correct model, correct strap type, and body bearing, the characteristic scratches as reported. Although this equipment did not prove involvement in the disappearance, it corroborated witness statements about Evan's presence at the shoot with the described gear. When opening the drawers under the desk, a technician discovered an unprocessed film box wrapped in clear nylon, undated. According to the investigative team's notes, the box contained multiple 35mm film rolls, some exposed but undeveloped, some unused. Because film could preserve images of events or people from the time overlapping Mara's disappearance, the entire box was sealed as evidence and transferred to forensic storage. In the same workroom, the investigative team found a topographic map of the Sandhills region spread on an auxiliary table. The map had red pen markings indicating several scattered points, mostly deep within the sandhill areas of northwestern Nebraska. When questioned, Evan stated they were landscape photography locations and that he often traveled there on weekends. However, given the inconsistency in his statement about his movements on the day in question, the map was considered potentially valuable for later comparison and was seized per inventory. The investigative team continued reviewing the remaining rooms, but found no personal items belonging to Mara or any indication she had ever been in Evan's home. No clothing, jewelry, documents, foreign objects, or other biological traces were present. The bedroom and kitchen also contained nothing unusual. All items were neatly arranged with no signs of hurried movement. Evan's garage held various car tools and some unused old items, but after inspection, the technical team concluded nothing was directly related to the disappearance. Evan's pickup truck was not within the warrant's scope, so the team was not permitted to access the vehicle at that time. In the internal report, the investigative team clearly noted that the search results provided no direct evidence of Mara's presence at Evan's home or any items that could be linked to her. Nevertheless, the seizure of the unprocessed film box and the marked Sandhills map was still evaluated as valuable, as these materials had the potential to clarify Evan's activities during the time frame where his statements failed to match actual data. These items were classified as pending analysis evidence, insufficient to establish guilt, but sufficient to form a basis for further checks in the next phase. The investigative team left Evan's residence after completing the process, updating the report to state that although no clear criminal elements were found, the inconsistencies in his statements, the presence of unprocessed film, and the map marking remote areas kept Evan as a continued focus of attention. From this point onward, he remained a person of interest, an individual connected to the sequence of the disappearance, but without grounds for charges or restriction of liberty. and the investigation had to temporarily rely on indirect evidence until deeper analysis results from the newly seized items became available. After the search warrant execution at Evan Halberg's residence concluded without recovering any direct evidence related to Mara Ellison's disappearance, the investigative team returned to focusing on witnesses who could potentially provide information about Evan's behavior at prior events. The three amateur models, Jenna Moyer, Kayla Bricks, and Lacey Dorn, were individuals who had photographed with Mara and had significant interaction time with Evan at various open shoots before the day of the disappearance. The goal of this investigative step was not to find physical evidence, but to determine whether Evan exhibited any noteworthy recurring behavior, thereby assessing the level of risk he might have posed to young models like Mara. Jenna's statement was collected first. She reported having encountered Evan at least 5 photo shoots since the beginning of summer 2003. According to Jenna, Evan typically did not stand in the central area where most photographers gathered, but instead positioned himself at the edges of the shoot to observe before approaching individual models. On at least 2 occasions, Evan suggested that Jenna step away from the group to try a separate lighting angle or find a less cluttered background, leading her to more isolated areas, often behind the old barns at the fairgrounds. Jenna stated that she declined these suggestions, not because she suspected danger, but because she felt uncomfortable shooting in secluded locations. When asked for more detail, Jenna described that Evan always waited until other photographers were occupied or distracted before approaching her, and he frequently offered gentle compliments to build trust. She confirmed that Evan never touched or pressured her, but his persistent attempts to separate her from the group made her feel unsafe if she were alone. Kayla Bricks, the second witness, provided a similar account of Evan's behavior. Kayla clearly recalled 2 shoots about 3 weeks apart, in which Evan proactively suggested she go to the old horse stables on the south side of the fairgrounds to try a series of portrait shots under sidelight. Kayla described Evan as very persistent, repeatedly emphasizing that the spot had better light and fewer people interfering with the background. On one occasion, Kayla agreed to go a short distance with Evan but stopped when she realized the area he was leading her to was too quiet and devoid of passers-by. She recounted that Evan did not appear upset when she refused to continue, only saying she was missing out on great shots, but the look in his eyes as he turned away left her feeling uneasy. When asked about his interaction style, Kayla confirmed that Evan rarely approached large groups and almost always singled out individuals standing apart for conversation. Lacey Dorn, the third witness, offered important supplementary testimony. She reported that Evan had once followed her closely during a shoot on the outskirts of Grand Island, not in a threatening manner, but enough for her to notice. According to Lacey, Evan typically began by observing from a distance, then gradually moved closer when she was separated from the group. On one occasion, he suggested she go to a small wooded area to the west to try natural-style shots, but she declined. Lacey also recalled that Evan usually spoke softly, stressing that secluded locations would produce more artistic photos and that not everyone understands how he works. All 3 statements, though each had different experiences, converged on 3 core points. Evan approached models when they were separated from the group, consistently suggested they move to less populated locations, and used technical excuses related to lighting or backgrounds to justify leaving the crowded areas. The investigative team recorded this overlap as a clear behavioral pattern rather than random actions. When compiled, Evan's behavior displayed the following characteristics, targeting young models not accompanied by large groups, waiting for moments when they were out of general attention, offering professional-sounding suggestions to build trust, and attempting to lead them to isolated areas. This was the pattern the investigative team identified as the isolation approach, a method of isolating contact in which the subject seeks to reduce potential witnesses by separating the target from a safe environment. Although none of the 3 witnesses had ever been harmed or directly threatened by Evan, this pattern indicated recurring behavior with a consistent structure and the potential to create risk for those who were less cautious. Given that Mara was a young model, new to the shoots, and eager to expand her portfolio, it was entirely plausible that she would agree to try individual shots, especially since Evan had been observed speaking with her multiple times during the event leading up to her disappearance. This section's report concluded that the statements from Jenna, Kayla, and Lacey not only helped reconstruct Evans' operating style within the amateur photography community, but also provided a recurring behavioral pattern that helped explain how he could have approached Mara without drawing attention. These facts, though not incriminating in themselves, helped police clarify the consistency in Evans' behavior and reinforced the assessment that his being the last person seen with Mara was not coincidental but consistent with a pre-existing approach pattern. The compilation of statements from the 3 female witnesses and the identification of Evan Halberg's isolation approach pattern forced the investigative team to consider the possibility that Mara had been taken to a secluded location after leaving the fairgrounds, leading to the decision to expand the search area beyond Alda Road. Search Operation #2 was activated to sweep areas that could have been used as temporary stopping points, hiding locations, or places to abandon a victim based on the geographic characteristics of Grand Island and the behavioral habits derived from witness statements. 3 target groups were identified: abandoned barns on the city outskirts, areas along the Platte River with access points to the water but low foot traffic, and a portion of the Sandhills fringe to the northwest. A vast, complex terrain often used by landscape photographers to test equipment. The first search team was deployed to the row of old barns along County Road 14, formerly used as grain and farm equipment storage, but vacant for many years. The area fit the victim isolation pattern: far from residential zones, low traffic, numerous concealment points, and no lighting system. Technicians searched each barn individually, using specialized tools to open doors when necessary, while checking floors, drag marks, decomposition odors, or any objects that appeared to have been left within the 24-48 hours near Mara's disappearance. However, all checks came back empty. Barn floors were dry and thick with dust, no fresh footprints, and no personal items that could be linked to Mara or Evan. The K9 team sweeping the perimeter also gave no alerts for human scent. The second search team headed to the Platte River fringe, along 2 small branching access points where seasonal fishing spots were active. The terrain changed rapidly due to water flow and wind, meaning any traces present would be easily erased. Nevertheless, since 2 witnesses had mentioned Evan seeking natural light or low background noise locations, the investigative team still considered it a necessary target. Patrol officers conducted sweeps along the banks, checking trails leading to the water, dense brush areas, and silt deposits where vehicles could briefly stop. Some tire impressions appeared near the fishing station, but upon cross-reference, matched local drivers passing through over multiple days, not tied to the specific afternoon time frame. The underwater rescue team also quickly scanned a narrow section with sonar equipment, but found no signs of submerged foreign objects. Grass areas along the riverbank showed no signs of uprooted vegetation or notable soil disturbance. By the end of the day, this team reported no relevant traces found. The third team was responsible for surveying the Sandhills fringe, though not venturing deep into the dunes, but checking the edges accessible from Grand Island, reachable by pickup truck in a short time. The terrain included mixed dirt and thick grass patches, interspersed with small mounds and trails wide enough for a single vehicle. Since witness statements described Evan frequently mentioning natural backgrounds, the possibility that he had used Sandhills access points to test shots was considered plausible. However, the open and expansive terrain made visual trace sweeping inefficient. The K9 team was worked on long leads in an open corridor pattern, moving along the most prominent trails. Some areas showed recent tire tracks, but close inspection by the investigative team noted they could not be dated and could belong to farmers moving equipment in recent days. No personal items, clothing, backpacks, or scattered debris appeared within the search radius. The absence of any indicators in all 3 high-priority areas caused the initial expanded search to reach a dead end. The comprehensive evaluation report for Search Operation #2 stated clearly, no body was found, no key traces were discovered, no secondary crime scenes were identified, and no environmental factors supported determining Mara's direction or stopping point after appearing on Alda Road. In the concluding assessment, the investigative team emphasized that the greatest limitation of 2003 search efforts was the lack of real-time movement tracking tools and traffic camera systems to narrow the scope. Additionally, Nebraska's geographic characteristics, vast, open, numerous side roads, low population density, made locating a missing person within tens of kilometers exponentially more difficult without clear directional leads. Although the search teams had covered the 3 areas rated as most probable, the overall geographic scale of the region far exceeded the manpower and survey equipment capabilities of the time. The investigative team concluded that, upon completion of Search Operation #2, no additional field data emerged to narrow the scope or eliminate areas. This reinforced the reality that determining Mara's final location could not rely on existing physical traces, and no indicators showed she had moved in any specific direction after appearing on Alder Road. The results of the expanded search in Search Operation #2 were reported back at the end of the first week since Mara Ellison's disappearance, and the content of this report quickly revealed that the investigation had reached a clear deadlock. Although the task force had covered the 3 highest probability areas, abandoned Barn Row, Platte River Fringe, and Sand Hills Edge, no new evidence of any kind was found. No signs of a body, no personal items, no signs of struggle, no drag marks, and no environmental data that could narrow the scope or determine the direction the victim left the vehicle location. The K9 teams detected no fresh human scent, and all recorded tire impressions could belong to various vehicles passing through over multiple days, not attachable to the afternoon of August 21st. When compiling all data from the vehicle scene, the barns, riverbank areas, and Sand Hills Fringe, the investigative team was forced to acknowledge that no physical lead pointed to Mara having appeared at any location beyond Alder Road. In most other missing persons cases, finding even a piece of clothing, a shoe print, a personal item, or a clear movement trend would be sufficient to expand investigative directions. But in Mara's case, every avenue of approach ended in a void. At the same time, the suspect's status showed no progress. Evan Halberg, though the last person verifiably with Mara, remained unbound by any direct evidence. His statement contained numerous inconsistencies, particularly the unexplained time gap between 4:56 p.m., but inconsistencies in testimony alone were not legal grounds for arrest or prosecution. All items recovered from Evan's home, including the unprocessed film box and the marked Sand Hills map, though noteworthy, contained no clear information linking to Mara at the time of the search. No victim belongings appeared in his home, no signs of hurried cleanup, and no suspicious traces on his equipment. In operational files, suspect with no supporting evidence is the most dangerous status because it pushes the investigation into complete reliance on speculation without the ability to bolster it with real data. When reviewing the full set of witness statements, Evan's recurring behavioral characteristics still did not cross the threshold of suspicious behavior. He had never been reported at prior events, had no history of violent crime or harassment, and no specific threatening actions were documented at the fairgrounds. His attempts to separate models from groups were confirmed by 3 witnesses, but the witnesses themselves admitted there was no coercion or violation, placing the detail only in the noteworthy category rather than dangerous behavior. During internal meetings at the Hall County Sheriff's Office in late August 2003, the investigative team agreed that all initial approaches, the vehicle scene, travel routes, behavioral patterns surrounding secluded areas, had failed to yield progress. The forensic baseline report provided no leads, the movement possibility map could not be narrowed, I-80 driver statements were contradictory and unverifiable, and the field search areas were too vast to identify the next focal point. The failure to locate the victim after days of continuous searching pushed the case beyond the scope of a standard missing person investigation. Nevertheless, under Nebraska's 2003 investigative standards, elevating a case from missing person to criminal suspicion required physical evidence or specific circumstances proving a crime had occurred. In Mara's case, no such evidence existed. Therefore, the investigative team had to comply with operational guidelines if after several days of comprehensive review no new findings emerged, and if no suspect met the threshold for prosecution or extended detention, the case would shift to passive status pending further information. In the final meeting of the initial investigative phase, the team lead summarized 3 critical points. 1. No new evidence emerged from the search process. 2. No suspect, including Evan Halberg, met the probable cause threshold for stronger measures, and 3. The victim's location and any specific conduct leading to the disappearance could not be determined. These conditions led to the decision the investigative team did not want closing the active investigation file. Per Nebraska procedures at the time, closed files were transferred to storage in Lincoln, where unsolved cases were preserved pending new public tips or federal agency matches. In the summary report, the investigative team explicitly noted that Mara Ellison's file was not permanently closed, but classified as inactive pending new evidence, meaning it could only be reopened if new physical evidence, new witnesses, or sufficiently strong technical factors emerged to overcome the limitations of the 2003 investigation. With Mara's vehicle, witness statements, travel routes, and field searches yielding no progress, the disappearance was placed in suspended status per protocol, and all related materials, including scene photos, statements, route diagrams, and evidence seized from Evans' home, were sealed and sent to the Lincoln storage facility in early September 2003. 12 years after Mara Ellison's missing person file was transferred to the Lincoln storage facility, Nebraska's Cold Case Unit, a division established to review cold cases with potential for reinvestigation, began its periodic assessment of unresolved files from the early 2000s. At that time, Sergeant Leon Kearns, a veteran investigator with over 20 years of experience in scene analysis and overlooked evidence evaluation, was assigned to review a group of long-term missing persons cases exceeding 10 years without clear resolution. The objective of this process was to identify cases where advances in forensic technology, image analysis techniques, or federal databases could provide breakthroughs unavailable to investigators. In 2003, among more than 20 files on the review list that year, Mara Ellison's case stood out not because of bizarre circumstances or high public attention, but because the attached evidence inventory included one item marked as unprocessed, a box of film seized from Evan Halberg's residence that had never been developed due to technological and budgetary constraints at the time of receipt. When Sergeant Kearns reached this entry in the file, he immediately noted that any image data related to the day of Mara's disappearance could contain useful information, especially since several prior cold cases had been solved by reanalyzing old images with modern techniques. Beyond the film box, the file summary indicated no official primary suspect, no incriminating physical evidence, and all initial investigative leads ending in dead ends. This very lack of traces made Mara's file a suitable candidate for reevaluation. When no specific direction exists, any small clue from unexploited evidence can alter the entire case structure. In an early April 2015 internal meeting, Kearns presented his assessment to the Cold Case Unit team. He highlighted 3 factors making this file a priority. 1. The existence of evidence unprocessed by modern technology. 2. The sufficient passage of time since the disappearance for involved individuals to change behavior, potentially creating openings. And 3. The file lacking any early misguided conclusions, meaning no dominant hypothesis had skewed data interpretation. Based on that analysis, the unit agreed to formally add Mara Ellison's case to the reinvestigation list. The cold case reactivation procedure was initiated immediately after the meeting, beginning with retrieval of all documents from the Lincoln storage facility. Boxes containing statements, route maps, search reports, scene photos, and secondary evidence were transferred to the analysis room under proper chain of custody protocols. The forensic technical team isolated the film box seized from Evans' home, documenting the physical condition of the rolls and checking for degradation risk before processing. Kearns assembled a reinvestigation team of 3 core members: a behavioral and pattern analysis specialist, a forensic imaging technician responsible for image processing, and a data specialist tasked with cross-referencing the file against national databases. He also served as case coordinator, responsible for defining the focus of each investigative phase. In the first task assignment meeting, Kearns outlined the goal of the reinvestigation, not to prove old hypotheses, but to reevaluate all data as though the case were newly received. The team was instructed not to assume any 2003 conclusions were absolutely accurate, especially given the technological limitations of that era. For example, the forensic baseline report found no signs of coercion in Mara's vehicle. But that did not mean all traces present had been detected. 2015 trace particle techniques far surpassed 2003 capabilities. Similarly, the four-route movement possibility map that could not pinpoint a direction could be reanalyzed using advanced geographic data and modern movement modeling. The reinvestigation team also reviewed every statement in the file to assess accuracy and potential time-induced memory distortion. Kearns paid particular attention to the statements of the three female witnesses, Jenna, Kayla, and Lacey, because those statements described a recurring approach pattern by Evan that the 2003 investigative unit lacked tools to analyze deeply. In the 2015 context, where criminal behavioral analysis had advanced significantly, those descriptions could carry far greater value. Upon completing the preliminary review step, Sergeant Leon Kearns officially signed the decision to reactivate Mara Ellison's file and moved it to active status in the Cold Case Unit's case management system. The file was classified as missing person, high suspicion, based on the time gap, inconsistencies in the suspect's statements, and the presence of evidence with potential to yield previously unexploited data. This reactivation process meant all related information would be re-examined from the beginning under 2015 standards rather than relying on 2003 technical limitations. For Kearns, the emergence of the undeveloped film box was not merely an old overlooked piece of evidence, but an indication that the original investigation had ended not because there were no answers, but because there were no tools to find those answers. Reopening the file opened the possibility of seeing, for the first time, what Evan Halberg had captured in the hours before or after Mara vanished, and with that, the 12-year-old cold case officially entered a new phase. The Cold Case Unit's Forensic Center received the film box seized from Evan Halberg's residence in early May 2015. This was the only piece of evidence in the Mara Ellison file that had never been processed previously, and it was also the factor that led to the file being selected for reinvestigation. The imaging technician, following protocol for preserving aged evidence, first checked the temperature, humidity, and brittleness of the film before loading it into a new generation specialized developer. These 35mm film rolls had been sealed since 2003, bore no shooting dates, no content labels, and carried a risk of degradation due to oxidation over time. For that reason, the technical team decided to develop the film using a low agitation mode, reduced rotation speed, and stabilized chemicals to avoid damaging the emulsion layer. When the first roll began to reveal images, the entire team noted that the content was not limited to landscape shots, but included numerous interspersed portraits of unidentified women. The first and second rolls sequentially produced 47 photographs of women of various ages, most taken in outdoor settings, open fields, wooden backdrops, old barn areas, and even a few shots in what appeared to be the characteristic sandy terrain of western Nebraska. The poses were mostly portraits or half-body shots, closely resembling the way amateur photographers practice natural lighting techniques. However, what particularly drew the investigative team's attention was not the number of subjects photographed, but a clue that emerged on the third roll. When the images were scanned and enlarged, 4 of them clearly showed Mara Ellison, positively identified by her family, and cross-referenced with 2003 photographs, standing at a location that was not the fairgrounds. She was wearing clothing, matching what she had on the day she disappeared, but the background was entirely different. No wooden gates, no old fences, no parking area. In the photos, Mara stood near an unusual rock formation, not the rounded natural boulders typical of Platte River sites. This rock structure had sharp, angular edges, vertically layered strata, and a pale, mottled surface resembling wind-eroded sandstone. Some sections of rock behind Mara displayed horizontal cracks, looking like a small cliff face weathered over time by wind. The investigative team immediately determined that this was not terrain around the fairgrounds, nor the agricultural land near Alder Road. According to Nebraska geological databases, columnar layered rock formations of this type only appear in certain areas along the Sandhills Fringe, approximately 90 kilometers from Grand Island. In other words, if these photographs were taken on the day of her disappearance, Mara and Evan had left the fairgrounds and traveled a far greater distance than any assumption made in 2003. The first 3 photographs of Mara were taken from close range, with sidelight from the southwest, indicating the shooting time was likely between 3:30, 5 p.m. In the 4th photograph, the most critical one, Mara stood slightly off to the right of the frame. The sandstone cliff remained in the background, but in the lower left corner of the image, a new detail appeared, a bright reflective area showing an elongated, shadowy, angular shape. When enlarged using light analysis software, this reflection became clearer. It was not lens flare, nor a human shadow. The technical team recognized the curve of a hood, the straight line of a door edge, and the distinctive shadow angle of a square cab pickup truck. When compared to photographs of Evans' pickup truck from the 2003 file, the parameters matched: cabin height above ground, paint curvature, and even a small scratch mark on the left edge, identical to descriptions in the 2003 vehicle inspection report. Technically, this did not prove Evan harmed Mara, but it established that 1. Evan was present at the location shown in the photo. 2. Mara was standing near Evan's truck. 3. The shooting location was not the fairgrounds. And 4. Evan's travel timeline completely contradicted the account he provided 12 years earlier. As subsequent frames on the roll were processed, several other women appeared in similar sandstone cliff environments. Investigators noted that while these photographs could not be dated, a pattern repeated: models positioned near rock faces, sidelight conditions, and framing that indicated Evan tended to select remote locations with distinctive geological features. This aligned with the isolation approach pattern described by the 3 witnesses: private approach, leading to low traffic areas, using lighting excuses, and creating shooting conditions with only himself and the model present. The investigative team paid particular attention to another detail. In several images, the eroded rock surfaces showed horizontal scratch marks and unusual flaking patches, as though a hard object had scraped against them. Although not considered direct evidence, this helped the geographic analysis team narrow corresponding areas on the Sandhills map that Evan had marked in red, the evidence seized from his home. Kearns instructed the technicians to classify the images into 3 groups: 1. Images containing Mara, 2. Images of other women at the same area, 3. Landscape shots without people. This classification helped determine whether contexts overlapped across the images, thereby confirming the location. When reviewing the continuous sequence in Group 1, technicians noticed a subtle detail in the 4th photo showing the truck reflection. The background behind the cliff also included the curve of a low crescent-shaped dune to the right of the rock face. When cross-referenced with Sandhills topographic maps, particularly the points marked on the map seized from Evans' home, a small geological feature west of Broken Bow matched most closely: low layered sandstone cliff, pale yellow sand base, and a crescent dune in the same relative position as in the photo. The investigative team recorded the film analysis results as follows. The 47 portraits of women indicate Evans' habit of shooting individual portraits outside common shoot locations. The 4 images of Mara prove she was taken to a location entirely different from the fairgrounds in the time frame, immediately before her disappearance, and the photo with the truck reflection shows Evans' vehicle was present at that location. Most importantly, these images provided the first field-verifiable clue in 12 years that could be plotted on a map. With the film processed using 2015 technology, the cold case unit not only obtained sharper images, but also the ability to analyze reflection details, light coloration, and geological structures, elements that could not be exploited in 2003. The final report for this section concluded that the film rolls developed in 2015 delivered the first lead since the case went cold. Mara Ellison was present at a location on the Sandhills Fringe on the day she disappeared, and Evan Halberg, via the reflection in the photograph, was also present there. Immediately after the film rolls were developed and the 4 photographs showing Mara Ellison at an unfamiliar sandstone formation were confirmed, Sergeant Leon Kearns transferred all imaging data to the cold case geographic spatial analysis team. The central task of this phase was to determine whether the location in the photographs could be pinpointed on Nebraska geological maps based on terrain features, mineral characteristics, light direction, and rock structure shapes. In the context of the sandhills, a region spanning thousands of square kilometers with dunes, low sandstone cliffs, and interspersed valleys, locating the site by eye alone was nearly impossible. However, using 2015 3D GIS technology, integrated with mineral maps and high-resolution terrain models, the analysis team began matching each photo feature against geographic data. First, they analyzed the rock coloration in the fourth photo, showing the truck reflection. The rock displayed pale yellow tinged with faint red, with horizontally layered sediment and distinct cracking, structures common where the sandhills border ancient sandstone quarries. When compared to Nebraska Geological Survey mineral maps, the team identified only a few areas with matching characteristic strata west of Halsey, near northern Thedford, and the eastern Mullen Rock Belt. The GIS comparison team then built a 3D model based on the sunlight angle in the photo. Light slanted from the southwest, casting shadows to Mara's right and extending across the rock face, indicating a shooting time of approximately 4:50 p.m. under Nebraska summer sun conditions. Using the shadow angle and estimated height of the rock structure behind her, the team calculated the cliff face slope, approximately 1822 degrees toward the northeast. When this data was input into the 3D GIS, the system returned only 3 terrain clusters, matching the configuration, one near the Mullen Fringe, one west of Thedford, and one near the southern border of Hooker County. Next, the analysis team focused on a background detail in the photo, the low crescent-shaped dune to the right of the cliff face. This is a rare landform, occurring only where wind has shifted dunes in a west-east pattern, more commonly found in the northern sandhills of Cherry County, extending toward Mullen. When cross-referenced with wind pattern maps and field data, the only area matching the crescent orientation in the photo was a strip of land about 11 kilometers southeast of Mullen. The GIS team then entered mineral map data, wind models, terrain slope, rock color, and sunlight direction into a unified analysis model. The automated filter eliminated areas failing to meet at least 4 parameters, leaving 2 high-probability coordinates. Kearns requested the GIS team create a 3D simulation from the camera's perspective based on the truck reflection photo. Once the simulation was complete, the cliff shape, dune position, ground curvature, and distance from the reflection signal to the model matched 87–92% with a single site, a low sandstone formation segment on the southeastern Mullen Fringe, Nebraska. For the first time in the 12-year existence of the case, there was a defined coordinate instead of generalized sandhill speculation. In the report submitted to the cold case unit, the GIS unit recorded 3 main conclusions. 1. The rock structure in the photo closely matched sandstone layers in the Mullen area. 2. Wind patterns and the crescent dune shape ruled out areas north of Halsey and west of Thedford. 3. Sunlight, angle and shadow direction aligned with terrain at coordinates 41, 889 degree N, 101, 8 degree W, at approximately 4:50 p.m. on the day of the disappearance. With a new coordinate identified, the investigative team for the first time had a specific field location tied to Mara's appearance, something never achieved in the 2003 investigation. Kearns noted in the report that this result not only directly linked Mara's image to a suspect location, but also confirmed Evans' vehicle presence in the same area via the reflection detail on the bright surface. Locating the coordinate near Mullen opened an entirely new investigative avenue, far exceeding the previous search radius limited to Alder Road. With 3D GIS data and mineral analysis, the cold case unit officially confirmed that the case no longer revolved around the question, which road did Mara take out of the fairgrounds, but shifted to a more central question, what happened to Mara after she stood in front of the sandstone cliff in eastern Mullen? This was the first time in over a decade that Mara Ellison's file had a coordinate-specific investigative direction, a critical advance the 2003 investigative system could not achieve. After the GIS unit identified the coordinate near Mullen, matching the rock structure in Mara Ellison's photographs, Sergeant Leon Kearns transferred all new data to the cold case behavioral analysis unit to reevaluate Evan Halberg's behavioral model. The objective of this step was not to conclude criminality, but to determine whether Evan's behavior, when combining the images, witness statements, and movement facts, aligned with any classified criminal pattern. The BOE began by re-examining the full set of 2003 statements. The way Evan selectively approached female models suggested they leave the group, led them to secluded areas under technical lighting pretexts, and maintained a context with only himself and the subject. When cross-referenced with the 2015 film image data, the BOE observed significant alignment. Mara appeared alone at a remote location, not the fairgrounds, with no other people in frame, and all shots taken from fixed angles, indicating complete control by the photographer. The behavioral analysis team concluded that Evan was not merely seeking individual angles, but tended to establish an isolated environment, a space in which the photographic subject no longer had group support and was entirely dependent on his guidance. This was the first characteristic falling within the BOE-defined pattern called isolation capture behavior, separating the victim from a safe environment through persuasion or exploitation of cooperation desire in a photography context. The BOE then compared photographs of the other women on the film rolls. Many were shot in similar positions: sandstone cliff backgrounds, sand dunes, wide open ground, sidelight conditions. This indicated Evan did not choose locations randomly, but had a familiar comfort zone in the field where he brought models. The behavior of returning to the same location to repeat the approach pattern was the second characteristic, belonging to the repeated site offender pattern. Next, the BOE analyzed movement data. Evan's 2003 statement claimed he left the fairgrounds alone and returned home immediately, yet the images showed him traveling with Mara to the Mullen area, nearly 90 kilometers away. The act of lying about a long travel distance, especially denying the victim's presence during that period, fell within the transport control pattern. The subject attempts to conceal travel time during the phase when the victim loses autonomy. Combining all data, the BOE identified three clear layers in Evan's behavioral sequence: 1. Isolation, approaching the victim when alone, creating technical pretexts, leading them away from populated areas. 2. Transport, moving the victim far beyond the initial location to a place he actively selected and knew well. 3. Control, placing the victim in a context where he alone held the camera, with all framing showing his behavioral direction. The BO paid particular attention to Mara's expression in the photos. No smile, no clear posing, standing straight, arms at sides, eyes looking off frame. This was not the typical posture at community events, where models usually actively display comfort. The BO did not conclude Mara was coerced, but recorded it as a positional compliance indicator, a sign the victim was not actively posing, but merely standing as directed by the photographer. When placing Evan's behavior in geographic context, the BO emphasized that the Sandhills region, particularly the Mullen Fringe, has low population density, no through traffic, and minimal likelihood of witnesses. Bringing a victim there requires planning, travel experience, and terrain familiarity. The BOL concluded this was inconsistent with the behavior of a mere amateur photographer and more consistent with the controlled environment offender pattern, an individual accustomed to bringing victims into spaces distant from support to exert full situational control. When assessing suspicion level toward Evan, the BOL applied a motive control criminal behavior scale. Evan met 7 of 9 criteria, selecting a more vulnerable victim, initially building trust, isolating the victim from the group, transporting the victim far from populated areas, maintaining a 2-person context, choosing familiar locations, and post-event denial. These characteristics, combined with the film images, caused the BOO to elevate suspicion from person of interest, behavioral concern, to high-risk behavioral suspect. Although no incriminating physical evidence yet existed, the BO's final report concluded that Evan Halberg's behavior closely matched a 3-phase criminal pattern: isolation, transport, control. While not concluding criminality, the BO stressed that Evan had a high likelihood of being the last person with information about how Mara left the fairgrounds and what happened to her at the location near Mullen. This significantly increased suspicion toward Evan and opened an investigative direction focused on verifying his movements on the day of the disappearance, cross-referenced with new GIS data and images obtained from the 2003 film rolls. Immediately after the BOE completed its behavioral assessment and raised the suspicion level toward Evan Halberg, the cold case unit moved to re-interview the 3 female witnesses from 2003, Jenna Moyer, Kayla Bricks, and Lacey Dorn, to re-examine their full statements with a new perspective, especially after learning Mara had appeared in the Mullen Fringe area of the Sandhills. When recontacted, all 3 witnesses were willing to cooperate because they had previously felt uneasy about Evan's approach methods at earlier photo shoots. The goal of these re-interviews was not to ask them to recall details already provided in 2003, but to determine whether in the current context, any information had been undervalued or overlooked because it was not considered important at the time. Jenna was the first to be re-interviewed. When investigators showed her enlarged prints from the 2003 film roll, the photo of Mara standing before the sandstone formation, Jenna took a few seconds to process, then confirmed the rock background did not belong to any area around the fairgrounds. When asked whether she had ever heard Evan mention shooting locations outside populated areas, Jenna paused, then said that during a previous shoot, Evan had mentioned beautiful cliffs in the western sand region. At the time, she thought he was referring to striking landscape spots and did not connect it to the Sandhills. When this description was cross-referenced with the new GIS data, Evan's reference to western cliffs fully matched the Mullen Fringe area, known for its low rock formations and exposed sandstone layers. This information had not appeared in the 2003 statements because Jenna did not think it relevant, but in the 2015 context, it became a significant indicator. Next, Kayla was invited for re-interview. Upon viewing the photo, she immediately recognized similarity to a description Evan had once given her: a place with very beautiful sidelight in the afternoon, some natural rock steps, and strong wind creating curves in the sand. Kayla admitted that in 2003, those words did not exceed normal photo invitation language, but upon seeing the film image and hearing investigators mention the Sandhills, she recalled Evan once asking if she was hesitant about traveling far from the city. Kayla believed Evan had intended to take her to the location now identified near Mullen. This was the second matching statement, and this time directly tied to terrain. Lacey was the last to be re-interviewed, and her statement provided the most important reinforcement. When investigators showed her the Sandhills map with markings found at Evan's home and asked if she had ever heard him mention a similar place, Lacey nodded immediately. She recounted that during a shoot a few weeks before Mara's disappearance, Evan had said he knew a quieter place, no one to disturb, with beautiful natural rock scenery. When pressed further, Lacey remembered him describing it as just over an hour's drive northwest, through the sand dunes. This caught the investigative team's particular attention because a 1-hour drive northwest from Grand Island led directly to the border area between Thetford and Mullen, the exact location identified by the GIS unit. When investigators showed Lacey the photo of Mara's rock background, she recognized the pattern of horizontal cracks in the cliff face. She confirmed she had once heard Evan compare that type of rock to soft stone in the Sandhills. This had not appeared in the 2003 file because investigators at the time had no knowledge of Evan's activities in geographic areas far from the fairgrounds. With 3 matching statements, the cold case unit created a parallel comparison table. 1. All 3 witnesses confirmed Evan had mentioned the Sandhills or similar terrain locations. 2. All 3 described Evan's tendency to select remote, isolated sites, fully matching the Mullen location. 3 descriptions of terrain, side light, layered rock, strong wind, sand base, aligned perfectly with the setting in the film images. This was an element the 2003 investigation completely missed, not due to human error, but because there was no visual data to connect witness descriptions to real terrain. But in 2015, thanks to the film images and terrain analysis, the old statements became critical puzzle pieces. The cold case unit recorded that 3 independent statements, never coordinated beforehand, all pointed to the same set of location characteristics Evan preferred, and that set fully matched the coordinate in Mara's photo. This created a seamless link between behavior, witnesses, and field data. Evan not only took Mara to a location far removed from his original statement, but had also once intended to take the other witnesses to a similar area, though all declined. The final compiled report for this section concluded that the re-interviews strengthened suspicion toward Evan Halberg, while creating a consistent data chain. Witness descriptions of Evan's location selection habit behavioral pattern analyzed by BAU-ED, actual photographs showing Mara at exactly that type of location, GIS coordinate, matching the descriptions. For the first time in 12 years, 3 independent sources converged on a single point, reinforcing the hypothesis that the location in the photograph was not merely a shooting site, but a pivotal position in decoding what happened to Mara Ellison on the day she vanished. Immediately after the re-interview, statements from Jenna, Kayla, and Lacey unanimously matched the coordinate identified by the GIS unit near Mullen. Sergeant Leon Kearns shifted focus to re-examining all old evidence previously deemed non-valuable in the 2003 file. One such piece of evidence was the soil sample collected from Evan Halberg's shoes during his initial interview. In 2003, this sample was not considered significant because no specific suspect location existed for comparison, and mineral particle analysis technology at the time was limited. The soil sample had been preserved in a sealed envelope bearing the forensic technician's signature from the time of collection. During the cold case unit's reinvestigation phase, Kearns recognized that any mineral traces remaining on Evan's shoes could become the first physical evidence proving he had set foot in the area corresponding to the location where Mara Ellison appeared in the film photographs. Accordingly, the sample was immediately transferred to the Mineral Microstructure Analysis Lab, equipped with scanning electron microscopy and energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy (EDs). Upon unsealing the sample, technicians noted that the remaining soil quantity was very small, only a fine dust layer mixed with tiny mineral grains, but still sufficient for structural and compositional analysis. Under SEM magnification, the soil layer was enlarged to allow observation of individual mineral particles. Initial results revealed 3 prominent mineral groups: rounded wind-abraded quartz grains, feldspar fragments mixed with iron oxide impurities, and especially scaly silcrete particles, a distinctive mineral type found near certain sandstone cliffs along the sandhills fringe. The analysis team recorded that the wind-eroded quartz characteristic of the sandhills has a highly identifiable shape: rounded grains, smooth edges, and surfaces bearing small dimples from prolonged wind action. When compared to soil samples collected around Grand Island, Alder Road, or the fairgrounds, no area produced similar results. Soil in those regions is primarily fine agricultural particles, lacking silcrete, and the quartz grains show no high degree of wind abrasion. The presence of wind-abraded quartz on Evan's shoes virtually ruled out the possibility that he had only been moving around Grand Island on the day Mara disappeared. However, the most critical finding emerged when technicians analyzed the mineral composition using EDS spectroscopy. The spectral data showed silicon, aluminum, and iron contents matching soil samples collected from 3 points along the southeastern sandhills belt near Mullen, the exact area the GIS unit had delineated from the film images. According to the Nebraska Geological Survey mineral records, this region is characterized by weathered sandstone layers producing distinctive silcrete grains rarely found elsewhere in the state. When the EDS spectrum of the soil from Evan's shoes was overlaid on reference spectra from the Mullen area, the spectral lines matched at a ratio of 0.92, a very high degree of correspondence for an outdoor soil sample more than 10 years old. This marked the first time the cold case unit obtained physical evidence directly linking Evan to the Mullen area location where Mara appeared in the photographs. Kearns immediately requested comparison with soil visible in the film rolls, where Mara's shoes appeared at the edges of some frames. Although the soil quantity in the images was too small for analysis, technicians noted a color similarity between the dust adhering to Mara's shoes and the sandhills sandstone layer. While this held no legal evidentiary value, it reinforced the field context depicted in the film images. To ensure the soil on Evan's shoes did not result from other activities, the BAU collaborated with the cold case unit to review his entire life schedule: workplace, regular travel areas, photography habits, No data indicated any professional or personal reason for Evan to travel deep into the sandhills. More importantly, in his 2003 statement, Evan asserted he did not leave the fairgrounds in a northwest direction and denied taking Mara to any location beyond Grand Island. Therefore, the soil sample on his shoes, matching Sandhill's composition, became direct contradictory physical evidence to his own testimony. The forensic team concluded in the report, the soil from Evan's shoes contains mineral components characteristic of the Sandhills and is inconsistent with any area around Grand Island or Alder Road. This led to a critical conclusion. Evan Halberg was present at a location with rock structures corresponding to those in the film photographs within a time frame close to when Mara appeared in the images. The cold case unit classified this as Level 1 physical linkage evidence, the highest level for soil samples in cold cases. It does not prove criminal conduct, but establishes presence at a key location, an element entirely absent from the 2003 investigation. The final report for the evidence analysis section recorded that the soil sample transformed a suspect with suspicious behavior into an individual with direct physical connection to the victim's last known appearance location. This was a major turning point. The first time since 2003 the investigation possessed a tangible, undeniable link between Evan Halberg and the coordinate where Mara Ellison's final images were captured, a result unattainable with 2003 technology. Immediately after the soil analysis results proved Evan Halberg had been present in the Sandhills area, matching the location in Mara Ellison's film photographs, Sergeant Leon Kearns advanced the case to the next critical phase, reconstructing the entire timeline of August 21, 2003, using 2015 simulation technology. The objective was to determine whether the gaps in Evan's statements aligned with the time required to travel from the fairgrounds to the coordinate near Mullen, and whether the lighting conditions in the film photographs matched the time period he denied. The cold case unit began by compiling all raw 2003 data, witness sightings of Mara at the fairgrounds, statements from Jenna, Kayla, and Lacey regarding when Mara left the group with Evan, the independent witness report of seeing them at Alder Road, and Evan's claim that he went straight home after the shoot. The investigative team re-entered these time markers into a reconstructed 2003 traffic map using Nebraska DOT data, simulating road conditions, average traffic volume, and reasonable speeds during the 4-6 p.m. window. The AI traffic model identified that the shortest route from the fairgrounds to Alder Road took approximately 12 minutes, consistent with the witness observation window. However, the pivotal point was the 2-hour gap after 5:02 p.m., the period during which Evan claimed he went home and processed film, yet no receipts, calls, or witnesses corroborated his presence at home between 5:15, 7 p.m. The cold case unit retrieved additional data previously deemed insufficient in 2003, gas station receipts along I-80 and Highway 97. Since payment systems at the time retained daily records, some small stations still held faded copies of debit card receipts. One receipt at 5:41 p.m. from a small gas station near Arnold, Nebraska, recorded a purchase of 8 gallons of fuel using a card matching Evan's bank account number, a detail impossible to cross-reference in 2003 because bank records were not broadly shared in missing persons investigation. The cold case unit incorporated this receipt into the timeline. The Arnold station location lay directly on the route, connecting Grand Island to the Mullen Fringe, and crucially, travel time from Alder Road to Arnold was approximately 38:42 minutes at continuous driving speed. The 5:41 p.m. timestamp aligned almost perfectly with the possibility that Evan left Alder Road immediately after the witness saw Mara beside the vehicle. From Arnold to the sandstone coordinate near Mullen required an additional 42:46 minutes. When the journey was simulated in GIS, arrival time fell between 6:25, 6:35 p.m., precisely the period when the late afternoon light in Mara's film photographs showed the sun in a low position, with side light angles matching astronomical data for August 21, 2003. Lighting technicians created a 3D forensic photometry simulation, inputting the suspect location, cliff height, shadow direction in the photo, and actual sunset time that year. The results showed that the light in the fourth photograph, the one with the truck reflection, best matched the 6:20–6:40 p.m. window. Thus, if Mara was photographed in the Sandhills at the simulated time, Evan must have been present at that location with her. This completely shattered the account he provided in 2003. After confirming the light-time correspondence, the cold case unit integrated the movement markers into the actual route. The journey simulation produced a perfect match. 4:50 p.m. depart Fairgrounds, 5:02 p.m. appear at Alda Road, 5:41 p.m. fuel stop at Arnold, 6:25, 6:35 p.m. arrive at Mullen Cliff. Film capture time. After analyzing Evan's behavior and determining his pattern fit the isolation, transport, control sequence, the simulated timeline further confirmed that Evan not only followed that route, but stopped precisely at the location in the photograph. Another element reconstructed using 2015 technology was Evan's truck fuel consumption. Based on the vehicle model he used in 2003, the system calculated that travel from Grand Island to Mullen and back required fuel equivalent to exactly 810 gallons, matching the Arnold transaction. This was the first technical match, proving Evan's described journey was impossible. If he went straight home, he could not have a fuel receipt in a town more than 70 kilometers northwest of Grand Island. Finally, the simulation team combined all data into a unified timeline. When presented to the cold case unit, Kearns concluded, the 2-hour gap Evan failed to explain in 2003 aligns perfectly with the journey to the Sandhills. This transformed the previously unverifiable time gap into high-level indirect evidence, proving Evan's presence at Mara's last known location. More importantly, for the first time in 12 years, the case timeline was no longer fragmented. It became a coherent logical chain. Witness receipt, light simulate movement, simulate terrain analysis, mineral data, and the entire chain pointed to a single point, the Sandhills area where Mara was last photographed alive. When the 2015 technology-based reconstruction of the August 21, 2003 timeline was completed and yielded perfect alignment with the journey to the Sandhills, Sergeant Leon Kearns moved to the comprehensive evaluation phase, combining all obtained evidence into a logical sequence to determine whether the level of suspicion toward Evan Halberg had reached the probable cause threshold, the legal standard required to seek an arrest warrant. The cold case unit assembled 5 key evidence groups, 1 film, 4 photographs showing Mara at the sandstone cliff near Mullen with Evan's truck reflection in the same frame, proving both were present at the same location. 2 soil, the sample from Evan's shoes containing Sandhills-specific minerals, matching the photo location and directly contradicting his claim of never leaving Grand Island. 3 GIS, terrain analysis, wind modeling, mineral data, and rock structure. Identification pinpointing the single coordinate matching Mara's photo background. 4 timeline, movement simulation aligning Evan's 2-hour gap with the route Grand Island Alda Road. Arnold Mullen. 5 behavior BOE determination that Evan's pattern fit the 3-phase isolation, transport, control model, consistent with his approach to female witnesses and with taking Mara to a remote location. When these 5 evidence groups were integrated, the cold case unit constructed a crime probability matrix, evaluating each piece by 3 criteria: independence level, linkage strength, and random coincidence probability. Film and soil were the strongest evidence because they were completely independent, yet both pointed to the same point: Evan's presence in the Sandhills. GIS, timeline, and behavior reinforced the reasonableness of the conclusion. When calculated using the 2015 Nebraska crime analysis model, the random coincidence probability for individual evidence groups was low, but the probability of all 5 groups coinciding on the same location, same person, and same time frame was virtually 0. The cold case unit reached an internal conclusion that the evidence exhibited high linkage and demonstrated intentional behavioral sequencing rather than explainable by coincidence or 12-year-old memory distortion. Another critical part of the evaluation was re-examining Evan's 2003 statements. He categorically denied leaving the fairgrounds with Mara, denied traveling northwest, denied stopping anywhere outside Grand Island. Yet film, soil, GIS, and timeline all proved the opposite. The falsehood of his statements on every key point transformed Evan from person of interest to primary suspect. Kearns and the Hall County prosecutor reviewed the legal threshold. Under Nebraska law, an arrest warrant may be issued when one evidence shows the suspect's presence at the location of conduct leading to the disappearance, two facts demonstrate the suspect concealed or lied about his activities during the critical time frame, and three, the evidence chain creates a probability greater than 50% that the suspect was directly involved in the victim's disappearance. In Mara Ellison's file, all conditions were met. Film and soil proved presence. Timeline and GIS proved the journey. Behavior and false statements proved concealment. The prosecutor assessed that the evidence chain not only exceeded reasonable suspicion, but reached probable cause, sufficient to seek an arrest warrant for further investigation. A 54-page summary was prepared by the cold case unit, structured chronologically, and including photographs developed from the film, mineral analysis, 3D GIS maps, light simulation, movement timeline table, re-interview witness statements, and BAU behavioral analysis. The summary was submitted to the Hall County Prosecutor's Office, along with a formal request for an arrest warrant for Evan Halberg in connection with Mara Ellison's disappearance. Upon review, the prosecutor stated that this evidence chain was exceptionally strong for a cold case over 10 years old. Although no body had been found, all data pointed to a single plausible scenario. Evan Halberg took Mara to the Sandhills, photographed her at the location near Mullen, and was the last person in contact with her. The application for the arrest warrant was approved shortly thereafter, marking the first time since 2003 that the case advanced to an active legal phase. The evidentiary affidavit requesting the arrest warrant for Evan Halberg was finalized in the second week of June 2015. Based on the 54-page comprehensive analysis from the cold case unit. In the affidavit, Sergeant Leon Kearns presented a tightly structured legal narrative, opening with the 2003 disappearance context, followed by newly developed film evidence, including 4 photographs of Mara at the Sandhills sandstone cliff, and the reflection of Evan's truck in the same frame. Then the mineral analysis of soil from Evan's shoes, proving his presence at the exact area in the photographs. Next, the GIS results, identifying the single matching coordinate for the rock background. And finally, the movement timeline simulation showing Evan's 2-hour gap, perfectly aligned with the route to Mullen, Nebraska. The affidavit also included the BAU assessment that Evan's behavior fit the 3-phase pattern: isolation, transport, control, and that his false statements on all critical points indicated concealment of conduct related to the victim's disappearance. After completion, the cold case unit submitted the file to Lincoln County Court for approval of an arrest warrant under the probable cause standard. The review hearing took place in a closed session where the judge required cross-verification of each evidence group to determine whether the file possessed sufficient independence, logic, and avoided over-inference. The prosecution representative argued that film soil GIS timeline behavior formed a strong linked evidence chain, independent of any single witness statement, and with virtually no possibility of random coincidence. The judge paid particular attention to the detail of Evan's truck reflection in the photograph, an irrefutable proof of his vehicle's presence at the suspect location, and to the SEM results, showing Sandhill-specific silcrete minerals, which could not appear on Evan's shoes if he had only been in Grand Island that day. After reviewing the light simulation and astronomical cross-reference, the judge noted that the precision of 2015 scientific data far exceeded 2003 verification capabilities, thus providing a solid legal foundation for the affidavit. At the conclusion of the hearing, Lincoln County Court officially issued the arrest warrant for Evan Halberg in connection with Mara Ellison's disappearance, authorizing additional searches if necessary. The warrant was statewide in Nebraska and included coordination requirements with local agencies to prevent flight. Upon approval, Kearns convened an operational briefing. The cold case unit assessed that Evan, having lived in isolation for many years, was highly likely still residing in an area he frequented, though no longer in Grand Island. Bank data and vehicle registration records showed he had moved to an old house near Broken Bow in 2011, a location midway between Grand Island and Mullen. allowing access to both without drawing attention. The arrest needed to be executed swiftly before news leaked, or Evan became aware of the file reactivation. The operational team was divided into 3 groups. Group 1, direct approach to Evan's residence near Broken Bow. Group 2, control of main routes and side roads leading to Highway 2 and Highway 97. Group 3, remote surveillance, monitoring all suspect vehicle movements for 24 hours prior to Group 1's approach. Kearns requested support from local tactical units due to the semi-rural terrain around Broken Bow, with numerous dirt branches and only one primary access road to Evan's house. The approach had to ensure 2 priorities: officer safety and no opportunity for the suspect to flee or destroy documents. A covert arrest plan was established. Group 3 would conduct surveillance starting the previous evening, logging Evan's movement habits. Group 2 would position unmarked vehicles at key intersections. Group 1 would prepare to approach at 6:30 a.m., the time Evan typically opened the door to let his dog out, per neighbor information. All personnel were ordered to maintain absolute secrecy to prevent premature disclosure of the warrant. On the night before the arrest, Kearns reviewed the entire file one final time. He noted, "For the first time in 12 years, every piece fits into a unified behavioral axis." As the operational team departed the office en route to Broken Bow, this was also the first time since 2003 that the investigation no longer relied on hypotheses, but on a clear, scientific, and legally weighty chain of evidence sufficient to propel the case into its next chapter. The operational team executed the arrest plan for Evan Halberg at 6:30 a.m., exactly as scheduled in the tactical briefing. A light fog still covered Broken Bow, and the suburban house where Evan resided stood isolated at the end of a dirt road with only one access point, precisely the kind of location tactical teams prefer when full control of the approach space is required. The remote surveillance group had been in position since 4:50 a.m., noting that a light inside Evan's house came on around 5:15 a.m., consistent with the early rising habit described by neighbors. At 6:29 a.m., Evan opened the front door and let his old dog out into the yard. That was the moment Team 1 received the go-ahead to move. 3 unmarked vehicles advanced along the dirt road from 2 directions, sealing off the entire exit. 2 officers approached from the front, while another team circled to the rear to ensure the suspect had no escape route. Evan noticed the tactical team's arrival only seconds before the arrest warrant was read aloud. He startled, took one step back, but did not resist. An officer quickly secured both hands, applied handcuffs, and moved him away from the doorway for safety. The entire sequence took less than 20 seconds, clean, efficient, and without incident. As Evan was escorted to the cruiser, the preliminary search team entered the house under the arrest warrant's immediate search authority to ensure no additional persons or hazards were present. The small, modest house contained old furniture, and on the work desk, exactly as Kearns had anticipated, lay another unprocessed film box labeled Batch #12. This box was not listed in the 2003 evidence inventory, proving Evan had continued photographing for many years after Mara's disappearance. Batch #12 was sealed on-site, assigned an evidence number, and transferred to the forensic vehicle. Aside from the film box, the search team found no weapons, no signs of hurried cleanup, and no documents directly related to Mara. However, the existence of Batch #12 was significant to the cold case unit. Any of Evan's film rolls had the potential to contain information about locations he considered familiar operating zones, a factor that had been pivotal in analyzing the 2003 film. As Evan was placed in the cruiser, he did not ask why he was being arrested. He only muttered a question about who would care for his dog. An officer reassured him that local services had been contacted for temporary care. There was no resistance or attempt to flee, scenarios for which Kearns had prepared contingency plans. The convoy immediately departed Broken Bow and headed to Grand Island, where an interview room was already prepared. Throughout the more than 1-hour drive, Evan sat silently, saying nothing. The handcuffs held his wrists close together, but not tightly, per safe transport protocol. An observing officer noted that Evan kept his gaze fixed downward and showed no reaction when informed of his right to an attorney. At Grand Island, Interview room 3 was sealed and equipped with 2015 standard recording devices. Kearns directed that the number of personnel in the room be kept to a minimum to avoid unnecessary pressure, as the primary goal was to elicit information about Mara's final location, something only Evan could confirm. While the transport team escorted Evan into the room, the forensic team transferred batch #12 to the evidence processing lab, where technicians prepared to examine the box exterior, sealing tape, fingerprints, and the condition of the rolls inside. They did not open the film, pending instructions from Kearns, but the mere existence of batch #12 already suggested Evan had continued traveling in the Sandhills or similar areas for years afterward. When Evan Halberg was brought into interview room 3 at 8:12 a.m., both hands were placed on the table as directed by the transport officer. When the recording camera light came on, he glanced up briefly, then looked down again, fixing his gaze on the empty space in front of him, as though trying to detach himself from the entire situation. The lead investigator entered, read the Miranda rights slowly and clearly. Evan nodded to indicate he understood but did not immediately request an attorney, a common response from suspects who believe they can still control the situation by remaining silent or denying everything. The interview began with baseline questions: current residence, travel habits, most recent employment. Evan answered briefly, in a low voice, without noticeable fluctuation. When the questioning shifted to the 2003 timeline, specifically the day Mara Ellison disappeared, Evan looked up, eyes slightly narrowed, as though trying to recall, or pretending to recall. The investigator asked whether he still remembered the photo shoot at the Nebraska State Fairgrounds. Evan nodded and repeated the same sentence he had given in 2003. I went there to try a few shots and went straight home. When asked if he left the fairgrounds with Mara, Evan denied it immediately, his tone suddenly sharper. No, I didn't go with her. I left alone. The investigator did not challenge the denial, but continued with open-ended questions, asking Evan to describe his route, leaving the fairgrounds that day. Evan restated his old account, went home, processed film, did not go anywhere else. This was precisely the point the interview team had prepared for. They knew spontaneous denials would reinforce contradictions when compared with the new evidence chain. When the investigator moved to the Sandhills area and asked directly whether Evan had ever been there on the day Mara disappeared, he immediately leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and answered in a distinctly defensive tone, I never went to the Sandhills with anyone. There was no reason for me to go there. The investigator gave Evan an opportunity to adjust his statement, asking whether he might have confused locations or passed through without remembering clearly. But Evan maintained his position, no, I did not drive up that way on that day. When asked about the red-marked Sandhills map, evidence seized from his home, Evan said it was only used to note scenic photography spots and had no connection to anyone, especially Mara. The investigator reminded him of his 2003 statement that he never left Grand Island on the day of the disappearance, and asked directly, do you reaffirm that? Evan stared at the wall and said slowly, yes, I did not leave Grand Island that day. This was his third consecutive denial, and the strongest. It rejected the entire movement model, the entire GIS result, the entire mineral evidence. When the investigator asked whether he recognized the setting in the film photograph, the one showing Mara in front of the sandstone cliff, Evan answered, I don't know that place. I didn't take that photo. I've never been there. This was interpreted as an absolute denial, as he not only rejected being in the Sandhills, but also denied ever photographing anything related to that area. The investigator remained neutral and continued by asking about the batch #12 film box just seized from his current residence. Evan said he had continued shooting landscapes and portraits over the years, but it had nothing to do with that girl's case. When asked whether he had ever photographed women in remote locations, Evan replied, only when they volunteered to go, but I never took anyone out of town. This was an indirect denial of the behavioral pattern identified by the BAU. When the investigator referenced statements from 3 witnesses describing his suggestions to move to secluded areas, Evan countered immediately. They remembered wrong. I only gave technical instructions. Another absolute denial. In the next phase of the interview, The investigator tried a different approach, asking what Evan remembered about Mara. He said she was one of dozens of models, and that he had no reason to remember her more clearly than the others. When asked why there were 47 individual portraits of women on the film, Evan said it was a long-standing photography interest and offered no explanation for why Mara appeared in an unfamiliar setting or why his truck reflection appeared in the image. When the investigator mentioned the sandhill-specific mineral traces on his shoes, irrefutable scientific evidence, Evan's demeanor changed. He no longer directly refuted, but shifted to vague argumentation. It could have come from some other time, though he could provide no life period to support the claim. This was a classic tactical shift from absolute denial to vague denial, evasion, and reliance on "I don't remember" instead of "I didn't do it." However, when the question returned to the core, "Did you take Mara to the Sandhills that day?" Evan replied with exactly 3 words, "I did not." The investigators noted that throughout the entire first interview session, Evan never once asked to see the evidence, never inquired where the film came from, and showed no surprise at Mara appearing in the photographs, a sign that his denials were not rooted in bewildered reaction, but in prepared, consistent positioning. At the conclusion of the first interview session record, the cold case unit concluded that Evan continued to deny any connection to the Sandhills, denied ever being with Mara at that location, and denied the entire movement sequence leading to the site where the film images were captured. Nevertheless, his denials created even more contradictions with the physical evidence, paving the way for subsequent phases of the interview strategy. The second interview session began at 2:05 p.m. the same day, after the investigative team spent several hours reviewing Evan's behavior during the first session and agreeing on a new strategy: direct, head-on confrontation with each group of scientific evidence to break through the absolute denial he was trying to maintain. Unlike the morning session, the investigator entered the room carrying a thick file containing enlarged prints of the film photographs, SEM mineral charts, 3D GIS maps, and the simulated movement timeline to Mullen. Evan looked up as soon as he saw the file, his eyes narrowing slightly, the first visible sign that his defensive posture was beginning to crack. The investigator opened calmly but firmly. "We're going to go through each piece. You can deny it, but science doesn't." Evan clenched both hands briefly before relaxing them, but said nothing. The team began with the film, the most visually direct evidence. They placed in front of Evan a sharp print of the 4th photograph, showing Mara beside the cliff, with Evan's truck reflection clearly visible in the lower left corner. At first, Evan glanced quickly and turned away as though trying to maintain distance, but the investigator asked him to look closely at the reflection. "You said you were never there. You said you never took Mara anywhere beyond the fairgrounds. So why is your truck in this picture?" Evan swallowed hard. A small but clear reaction. He answered slowly, "That's not my truck. Someone else has one like it." The investigator immediately placed the reflection image side by side with a 2003 photograph of Evan's actual truck, pointing out the distinctive scratch on the hood edge, identical in both. Evan squinted, looked away, and could only say coincidence. Without further argument, the team moved to the soil evidence. An SAM chart was placed in front of him, displaying the Sandhill-specific silcrete mineral. The investigator said, "This is soil taken from your shoes in 2003. This mineral does not exist in Grand Island, does not exist on Alda Road. It only exists where she was photographed." Evan looked at the chart, but instead of direct refutation, he shifted to evasion. "I might have been in that region some other time. I don't remember." The investigator remained calm but firm. "You don't remember, yet you're certain you never went there with Mara?" Those two statements cannot both be true. For the first time, Evan fell into a prolonged silence. The team recorded this as a break in the structure of absolute denial, a psychological indicator that he was beginning to recognize the gap between his statements and the evidence could no longer be covered. Next came the GIS. The investigator opened the 3D map, displaying the simulated rock formation and dune where Mara appeared, then overlaid the film photo onto the model. The match exceeded 90%. "We know where this is," the investigator said. "It's not the fairgrounds, not Grand Island, not any exit on I-80. It's near Mullen, exactly on the 2-hour route from the last place you were seen with Mara." Evan stared at the screen for a long time, then looked away. He no longer disputed the location, only muttered, "GIS, or whatever. I don't understand." The investigator replied, "You don't need to understand. You just need to understand. This is fact." Finally, the team presented the simulated timeline, the strongest combined evidence. They placed the 5:41 p.m. Arnold gas station receipt in front of Evan, along with the simulated route from Alda Road to Arnold to Mullen, cross-referenced with the light angle in the photograph. "The 2-hour gap in your statement can't disappear," the investigator said. "It exactly matches the time it took to take Mara to the sandhills." Evan drew a deep breath, his shoulders trembling slightly, but still clung to weak denial. "No, I didn't drive her there." The investigator did not respond, instead combining all the evidence, images, truck reflection, matching minerals, precise coordinates, behavioral pattern, movement timeline, fuel receipt, all laid out as a single chain. "You say you weren't there, but the film says you were. The soil says you were. The light says you were. The terrain says you were. The receipt says you were." Evan lowered his head, hands clasped tightly, no longer looking up. This was a classic sign of psychological faltering, no longer refuting with arguments, but retreating into defensive silence. The investigator continued, "We're not asking you about things without evidence. We're asking about what science has proven." Evan swallowed hard again, voice hoarse. "I don't remember. I don't think I did what you're saying." This was the first statement that did not contain absolute denial. The team recorded it as a major shift from total denial to vague denial, marking the collapse of Evan's defense strategy. However, even though his psychological posture had weakened, he still had not accepted responsibility or admitted any specific action related to Mara. The interview session ended with Evan's psychological state clearly deteriorated, caught between two extremes, no longer strong enough to refute the science, but not yet ready to confess. The third interview session resumed the following morning, when Evan Halberg's psychological state had clearly entered a phase of weakening after the direct confrontation with scientific evidence. The investigator entered the room with a softer demeanor, not carrying the thick file as before, but only a single photograph, the image of Mara standing in front of the Sandhills sandstone cliff, with Evan's truck reflection in the lower left corner. When the photo was placed on the table, Evan no longer averted his gaze as he had in the previous two sessions. This time, he held his eyes on it longer, his shoulders sagging slightly as though his resistance had nearly exhausted itself. The investigator began in a non-confrontational tone. "Evan, yesterday you said you didn't remember clearly. Science has shown us what we need to know. The rest belongs to you. Why did you take Mara there?" The question was not "did you take," but "why did you take?" Shifting from denial to explanation, a tactic designed to open the door to partial admission. Evan did not answer immediately. He placed both hands over his face, took a long breath, and then spoke the first words the team had waited more than 12 years to hear. "I did drive her there." The investigator remained silent for a few seconds to let him continue. Evan swallowed hard, voice cracking. "She wanted nice photos. She said she wanted something different for her portfolio. I told her. I knew a better place." This was the first time he confirmed the existence of the trip away from the fairgrounds with Mara, breaking the entire denial framework he had maintained since 2003. The investigator gently slid the photo closer and asked, "And the two of you went to this place?" Evan nodded very slowly. When asked to describe, Evan spoke weakly. "I'd been there before. The cliff. Strong wind. I thought the light would suit her." The investigator asked, "Did Mara agree to go?" Evan answered after a long pause. "She didn't object. I said I'd bring her back to the fairgrounds before dark." But, right after that statement, when the investigator asked what happened in the Sandhills, Evan began to waver strongly. He said, "Everything went wrong. It was an accident." This was the first appearance of the keyword, accident, and indirect admission that a harmful event had occurred, though he had not described it specifically. The investigator kept the focus. "What kind of accident?" Evan shook his head, hands visibly trembling. "I didn't want to hurt her. She slipped. I tried to hold her, but..." The investigator asked for details, but Evan began to fall into a defensive state. "I didn't mean to. I didn't do anything to her. It just happened. I panicked." In psychological interview analysis, This was classified as partial admission. The suspect acknowledges part of the event, but distances himself from legal responsibility by labeling it an accident. The investigator asked further, "Evan, if it was an accident, why deny it for 12 years? Why lie about the sandhills? Why deny the film?" Evan pressed his hands to his forehead, voice breaking, "Because no one would believe me. Everyone would think I harmed her. I didn't intend to." The investigator moved to the central question. "After the incident happened, where was Mara? Where did you leave her?" Evan immediately tensed, as though the entire interview process had pushed him to a threshold he was not ready to cross. "I don't want to talk about that part," he replied, his tone turning cold very quickly, a sign that defensive mechanisms had reactivated. The investigator pressed, "You left that place alone. So where is her body?" Evan shook his head forcefully. I don't want to answer that." This was deliberate refusal, not because he did not know the answer, but because he knew it clearly and was determined to withhold it. When the investigator reframed the question in a non-confrontational way, "We need to know so we can give her family answers," Evan still held firm. "I can't say." Even while denying direct responsibility, Evan had admitted three critical elements. He had taken Mara to the sandhills. They had been at the exact location in the photograph, and an accident had occurred, indirectly acknowledging that Mara did not leave that place in a safe condition. However, on the most crucial point, the location of the body, he remained silent, clinging to the minimum threshold of admission to reduce criminal liability. The interview session ended with the conclusion Evan Halberg had crossed the psychological breaking point, admitting the first part of the event sequence, but not yet the final part. The truth had opened half the door, the other half remained locked in the place he was still determined to keep secret. The next working session did not take place in the interview room, but was moved to a small conference room next door, where the Hall County Prosecutor's representative, Sergeant Leon Kearns, and Evan Halberg's temporarily appointed attorney were all present. The goal of the meeting was not to continue applying pressure, but to establish a clear legal framework for potential cooperation, because after the previous interview session, Evan had reached the threshold of breaking, but still withheld the most critical detail, the location of Mara Ellison's body. Evan was brought into the room in a state of exhaustion, shoulders slumped, eyes sunken from lack of sleep. His attorney whispered a few brief words, instructing Evan to answer only after fully understanding the legal consequences. The prosecutor's representative began in a calm, non-threatening tone. "Evan, you have confirmed that Mara went with you to the sandhills. You have admitted that an incident occurred. The rest we will find, whether you cooperate or not. But if you want her family to have answers, this is the time to do the right thing." Evan leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the table. The long minutes of silence showed he was weighing not only the legal implications, but also his own psychological limits. The attorney asked directly, "What specific offer are the investigators making?" The prosecutor replied, "If Evan provides the body's location, precise, immediately verifiable, we will consider a lower charging framework within the limits allowed by law, based on the factor of cooperation. However, there is no commitment to immunity." This was a form of limited cooperation agreement, commonly applied in long-term missing persons cases where the truth about the victim's location is considered especially valuable. Evan remained silent for nearly a minute, then sighed and spoke in a cracked voice. "If I tell you what happens to me," the prosecutor answered with absolute clarity, "you will still be prosecuted. But the degree of charge and sentencing range will reflect the fact that you provided information only you knew." Evan closed his eyes, hands clasped tightly together. This was the classic body posture of the early compromise phase, when the suspect realizes the denial strategy no longer works, and the consequences will be more severe if he continues to stay silent. Kearns gently placed the photograph of Mara on the table once more, but this time did not push it toward Evan. He set it in the middle, as a quiet reminder. Evan looked at the photo longer than before, then uttered a sentence so soft it was almost inaudible. "I don't want her lying out there forever." The attorney placed his hand on the table and gave a slight nod, the signal to proceed with negotiation. The prosecutor immediately requested clear information. "We need coordinates, terrain description, any natural landmarks. It cannot be vague. Evan looked down at his hands, trembling slightly. I can point it out, but I don't know exact coordinates like on a modern map. The investigator placed in front of him a 1/24,000 grid-marked sandhills map along with a pre-printed 3D terrain model. Evan hesitated for a moment, then pointed to the area southeast of Mullen. Here, but not right next to the main road, there's a deep sand gully and a dead tree trunk. Kearns asked him to describe more precisely. Evan slowly traced with his finger on the map. There's a faint turn-off trail, not many people know it. I parked near a sparse bush, then walked toward the tall rock, until I saw a wind-eroded depression in the ground. The investigator asked, "Where was she relative to that rock?" Evan swallowed hard, voice breaking. "Behind it, about 5-6 steps, near the exposed root. I didn't cover anything. The wind, and the sand." The prosecutor immediately asked him to confirm by marking directly on the map. Evan took the pen, handshaking continuously, and circled a small area in the position lying between two terrain bands previously identified by GIS, nearly matching the photo analysis. "Right here," Evan said, almost whispering. "If you go to exactly this spot, you'll find her." The attorney confirmed, "My client is providing the location in order to cooperate. All this information is recorded as voluntary." The prosecutor nodded and immediately drafted the acknowledgement document. Evan agreed to provide the body's location in exchange for consideration of a reduced charging framework within the minimum permitted range. When the meeting concluded, the map bearing Evan's circle was sealed as independent evidence, countersigned by all 4 people present in the room. For the first time since 2003, the investigation had obtained direct information from the only person who knew where Mara Ellison had lain for the past 12 years, and that was the key that unlocked the next phase, field verification. The forensic team was dispatched immediately the following morning, carrying the map bearing Evan Halberg's circle, sealed and confirmed in the agreement record. The Sandhills area Evan indicated lay deep in wind-eroded terrain, with no paved road leading directly to it, only a pickup-accessible trail. The 3-vehicle convoy left Grand Island at 6:10 a.m., consisting of the forensic team, GIS field support, and 2 cold case unit investigators. Upon reaching the vast sandy expanse southeast of Mullen, the landscape was completely open, with only connected dunes and low sandstone cliffs that the GIS team had already modeled during photo analysis. The forensic team parked approximately 200 meters from the marked location to avoid disturbing the scene. From there, they proceeded on foot following the map. What Evan described began to emerge exactly as stated, a faint trail created by old tire tracks, nearby a dead tree trunk severed by years of wind, and farther ahead a cliff structure that matched almost perfectly with the background in the 2003 film photograph of Mara. Kearns paused for a few seconds, observing wind direction and terrain. Every detail Evan provided was accurate to such a degree that he immediately knew this could not be guesswork or fabrication. This truly was the place Evan had stood 12 years earlier. The forensic team used stakes to mark a rectangular 25-hex, 25-meter perimeter based on Evan's description that the body lay behind the large rock, 5 or 6 steps away. The measurement team established the baseline from the cliff foot and calculated distance using average stride length. A 4-meter-long area was selected as the excavation site. The forensic team began removing sparse weeds, then used trowels and brushes to clear the surface sand layer. The sandhills feature loose, shifting sand, so every action had to be extremely slow to avoid disrupting soil structure. At approximately 30 centimeters depth, technicians noted a color change. The sand turned pale gray, mixed with organic fragments not naturally occurring. They immediately notified Kearns. When excavation deepened another 10 centimeters, a curved object emerged beneath the sand, at first only a very faint outline, but as soft brushes cleared the sand, human bone shape began to appear clearly. It was the outer portion of a skull, tilted to the right, not buried deeply as anticipated. Most likely wind had thinned the covering layer over many years. The entire team paused to photograph the full area before continuing to expose the remaining bones. As more sand was brushed away, the lower jaw and teeth became visible, followed by rib sections slightly offset to the east, an indication suggesting the body had initially lain on its side, rather than flat. The forensic team expanded excavation to both sides, locating the right humerus approximately 40 centimeters from the skull. Several bone segments were disarticulated, consistent with over 12 years of natural decomposition under strong wind and rodent activity. Nevertheless, the overall structure indicated an almost complete skeleton. At a depth of about 50–55 centimeters, technicians discovered a dark fabric fragment adhered with sand, degraded but still retaining fiber structure. Using specialized tweezers, they removed it and placed it in a separate tray, labeled as evidence. This was highly likely a remnant of the clothing Mara wore on the day she disappeared. Shortly afterward, a small metal object was found about 70 centimeters from the skull, a round earring, heavily oxidized. Mara's family had previously described her wearing small silver round earrings on August 21, 2003. The description matched the newly recovered item. The moment the earring was placed in the evidence tray was the moment the entire team became virtually certain they had found Mara. Kearns stood aside, silent for several minutes. This was the point the investigation had pursued for 12 years, the place Evan had brought the young woman to, and left her beneath a thin layer of sand in the desolate region. As most of the skeleton was uncovered, the forensic team reconstructed the body's original position based on wind direction, burial depth, and bone distribution. Preliminary findings indicated the body had not been deliberately buried deeply, but was likely left on the surface sand and gradually covered by wind over time. This aligned with Evan's statement that he didn't cover anything and simply panicked and left. However, the degree of decomposition and bone scatter also raised questions about the body's condition before being covered by sand. A hair tie was found near the hand bones, and just south of the excavation area, about 1.5 meters away, the forensic team discovered a small plastic fragment, possibly a broken piece of film canister or an item Evan had carried. All evidence was sealed independently. When the basic skeletal remains were collected, the forensic team used a 3D scanner to record the entire excavation pit structure for later reconstruction. By late afternoon, the excavation was complete. Human skeletal remains, multiple fabric fragments, one earring, a hair tie, and a small plastic piece were placed in biological storage containers, prepared for transport to the Lincoln lab. Kearns marked the completion time, 5:42 p.m. On the sand, only a stake depression remained, the place where for more than a decade the wind had buried the answer Mara's family had waited for. This was the final field verification step, proving Evan's statement was true, and simultaneously unlocking the next phase of the investigation, forensic analysis to determine cause of death and strengthen the prosecution file. The skeletal remains and evidence recovered from the sandhills were transferred to the Lincoln Forensic Lab that same night, and the following morning, the examination team began analysis according to protocol for fully decomposed remains. Because Mara Ellison had been missing for over 12 years, no soft tissue remained for evaluating tissue trauma, so the forensic team had to rely entirely on bone to determine cause of death. The first step was reassembling the skeleton along standard anatomical axes to assess completeness and detect abnormalities in the spine, ribs, and skull. When the skull and cervical vertebrae were aligned in correct position, the forensic specialist immediately noted a clear anomaly at C2. The odontoid process was fractured and separated, with a sharp, clean fracture line and anterior slippage. This was not damage from natural decomposition or animal scavenging. It bore the characteristics of a fracture caused by sudden forceful impact while the victim was alive or immediately before death. The C2 sample was isolated and submitted for micro-CT imaging to determine fracture type. Results showed a hangman's fracture pattern, commonly seen when the neck is forcibly hyperextended or when the body falls forward with significant force, impacting the chin or back of the head. The examiner concluded the force had a posterior to anterior or superior to inferior direction, strong enough to disrupt the C2, C3 articulation, resulting in airway obstruction or spinal cord injury, both capable of causing near immediate death. When cross-referenced with other bones, the forensic team found no evidence of long bone fractures, no rib cracks, no blunt force trauma to the pelvis or arms. This indicated the victim had not suffered multiple impacts. Instead, a single sudden concentrated force to the neck region was the direct cause. Complete decomposition prevented soft tissue analysis, so it could not be determined whether strangulation, asphyxiation, or vascular injuries were present. However, because the cervical vertebrae showed no twisting fractures or ligature marks, the forensic team ruled out manual or ligature strangulation. The presence of a single fracture at C2 made the scenario of fall from standing position with sufficient force to hyperextend the neck plausible. This also aligned with part of Evan Halberg's statement. He said she slipped and that it was an accident. Although Evan's statement was intended to minimize responsibility, the forensic findings did not entirely contradict that scenario. A C2 fracture can occur when the victim slips down a rock face or steep sand ledge, especially in the sandhills, where slopes can cause loss of balance if pushed lightly or if footing is lost while backing away. However, forensics could not confirm accident versus intentional shove, as bone does not preserve specific direction of force beyond proving strong impact to the neck. Another important point was the absence of defensive injuries on the hand bones, no phalangeal fractures or abrasions on the olecranon processes. This suggested the victim did not resist during the fall, possibly due to surprise or being placed in a position of easy imbalance. The forensic team concluded cause of death was C2 cervical fracture leading to spinal cord disruption and rapid death, within tens of seconds to under 1 minute. This conclusion was clearly stated in the report, cause of death, C2 cervical fracture due to forceful impact, mechanism of death, acute spinal cord injury pattern, consistent with forceful fall or push-induced fall. Additionally, evidence items such as the earring, fabric fragments, and hair tie were cross-referenced with family descriptions and photographs from the day of disappearance, confirming identification without needing DNA testing. After completing analysis, the forensic report was forwarded to the cold case unit and the prosecutor's office, marking the first confirmed determination of cause of death, an essential link in building the prosecution case against Evan Halberg on the corresponding charge. The Hall County Prosecutor's Office began drafting the charging document as soon as it received the forensic report confirming Mara Ellison's cause of death. The conclusion of C2 cervical fracture due to forceful impact causing rapid death was the final link needed to establish the mechanism of death and move the case from unexplained disappearance to death caused by the actions of another person. Based on the entire chain of evidence gathered during the reinvestigation, the prosecutor selected the charge of murder in the second degree under Nebraska law, applied to cases where death results without premeditation but occurs due to dangerous, criminally negligent, or intentional conduct, creating a substantial risk of death while the perpetrator is aware of that risk. This decision rested on the combination of Evan Halberg's accident admission, the injury pattern consistent with a forceful push or fall, and evidence showing he intentionally took the victim to an isolated location with no witnesses, creating conditions for environmental control. To construct the charging document, the prosecutor and cold case unit collaborated to organize the evidence file in logical investigative sequence to ensure that when presented in court, all facts connected seamlessly and eliminated alternative explanations. The file was divided into 8 main sections, each reinforcing the next. Section 1, 2003 context and timeline, including fairgrounds witness statements confirming Mara left the event with Evan at 4:50 p.m. and was last seen at 5:02 p.m. on Alda Road. Section 2, unalterable physical evidence chain, led by the 2003 film roll containing 4 photographs of Mara taken in the sandhills with Evan's truck reflection, clearly visible, proof he was present at that location while the victim was alive. Section 3, 2003 soil sample analysis from Evan's shoes, with SAM results proving sandhills-specific silcrete minerals, providing direct physical connection between the photo location and the suspect. Section 4, GIS analysis, identifying the photo coordinate matching near Mullen, Nebraska, terrain and light modeling, confirming the images were captured within Evan's unexplained 2-hour gap. Section 5, 2015 Movement Timeline Simulation, showing the complete route Grand Island Alda Road. Arnold Mullen, perfectly aligned with the 5:41 p.m. fuel receipt, photo light timing, and disappearance window. Section 6, BO Behavioral Analysis, identifying the repeated isolation, transport, control pattern across multiple potential victims and consistent with Evans' conduct toward Mara. This pattern reinforced the argument that taking Mara to the Sandhills was not random, but part of intentional behavioral sequencing. Section 7, Evans' partial admission in Interview 3, confirming he took Mara to the Sandhills and that an accident occurred, while not denying leaving the location alone. Although he did not accept responsibility for causing death, his description of the setting fully matched the forensic findings. Section 8, Body Recovery and Forensic Conclusion, identifying the victim as Mara Ellison through personal effects and skeletal features, and stating cause of death as C2 cervical fracture due to forceful impact, consistent with the description of slipping falling with force applied. A critical point in the charging document was the legal argument. Even in the scenario Evan described, accident, his conduct still satisfied the elements of murder in the second degree, because he intentionally took the victim to an isolated location, was aware of the risk, created dangerous conditions, and failed to seek help after the incident. Leaving the scene and abandoning the body further supported the element of reckless indifference, resulting in death. Upon finalizing the charging document, the prosecutor stated clearly, Evan Halberg, by intentionally taking the victim to a remote location, placing her in a dangerous situation, and applying force that caused T2 cervical fracture, resulting in rapid death, committed the crime of murder in the second degree under Nebraska law. The file was organized in order so that when presented in court, the events connected tightly from Mara's disappearance, to discovery of the remains, to scientific evidence, and the suspect's own statements. With the charging document complete, the 12-year stalled case now had a solid legal foundation to proceed to trial, marking the transition from investigation to prosecution. The trial of Evan Halberg opened in early November 2015 at Hall County Courthouse, drawing intense public scrutiny as it was a missing person case that had lingered for over 12 years before sufficient evidence could bring it to trial. When the trial began, the prosecution presented the charge of murder in the second degree, emphasizing that the case did not rest on a single confession or isolated piece of evidence, but on a tightly interconnected chain of scientific, behavioral, and physical evidence that fully reconstructed Mara Ellison's final journey. The prosecution opened with photographic evidence. 4 prints developed from a 2003 film roll were displayed on a large screen, showing Mara standing at the Sandhills sandstone cliff with Evan's truck clearly reflected in one frame. The prosecution stressed that this was direct, independent evidence, impossible to manipulate, and proved Evan was present at the location with the victim. Next came scientific evidence, the SEM report on silcrete minerals adhering to Evan's shoes, matching the characteristic soil signature of the Sandhills, a mineral not found in Grand Island or along Alda Road. The prosecution listed each analysis result, explaining how the wind-eroded quartz grain structures could only have occurred if the suspect had set foot in that specific area. The jury was shown comparative mineral spectrum maps, establishing a clear match between Evan's shoes and the site where Mara's body was found. Following that, the prosecution presented GIS and lighting simulations. A 3D terrain model, built from 2015 data, confirmed the cliff in the photo perfectly matched the location near Mullen, while astronomical lighting simulation for August 21, 2003, aligned with a time window of approximately 6:20–6:40 p.m., falling squarely within the 2-hour gap Evan could not account for in his 2003 statement. A video simulation of the route Grand Island Alda Road, Arnold Mullen was played, matching Evan's 5:41 p.m. fuel receipt from the Arnold gas station. When this chain of data was reassembled into a unified timeline, the jury watched a logical progression leading to an irrefutable conclusion. Evan had taken Mara to the Sandhills on the afternoon she disappeared. The prosecution then shifted to behavioral evidence. The BO presented an analysis of the isolation, transport, control pattern, showing Evans' habit of approaching young models, separating them from groups, and inviting them to remote locations for photo shoots. Statements from Jenna, Kayla, and Lacey were read back, proving this pattern had repeated multiple times and matched Evans' behavior leading up to Mara's disappearance perfectly. This section helped the jury understand that the trip to the Sandhills was not a spontaneous moment, but part of an organized behavioral template. The prosecution's strongest point came from Evans' partial admission during interview 3. Although he did not confess to murder, he confirmed taking Mara to the Sandhills and that an accident happened. The prosecution leveraged this to demonstrate that Evan had deliberately misled police for 12 years and only admitted the truth after scientific evidence forced him to confront reality. Finally, the forensic report. An expert presented the skull and a 3D model of the C2 cervical vertebra to the court, explaining the hangman's fracture mechanism, possible only from a sudden forceful impact to the neck, resulting in rapid death. The prosecution argued that even if Evan described the event as an accident, his actions, leaving the victim without seeking help, failing to report it, and concealing the truth for over a decade, demonstrated abandonment leading to death and clear awareness of the consequences. The defense attempted to persuade the jury that it was merely an accident, that there was no evidence of intent to kill, and that Evan had panicked rather than deliberately concealed anything. However, when the prosecution cross-examined, if it was an accident, why deny it for 12 years? Why hide the body's location? Why lie about never having been to the Sandhills? The defense had no convincing response. After 4 days of trial and 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict: Evan Halberg guilty of murder in the second degree. The judge read the sentence in court, noting that the penalty was based on the totality of conduct, bringing the victim to an isolated location, applying force that caused death, failing to seek assistance, concealing the body, and deceiving investigators over a prolonged period. With these factors, Evan was sentenced to 35 years imprisonment at the Nebraska State Penitentiary. When the sentence was read, Evan showed no strong reaction. He bowed his head, hands clenched, like someone who had long anticipated the inevitable. The prosecution entered into the record. This sentence fully reflects the defendant's accountability for the death of Mara Ellison and the years-long concealment. For the first time since 2003, the truth about Mara's final hours was established in law and closed with an official verdict. The Mara Ellison case was summarized in the Cold Case Unit's final operational report as a classic example of how a long-stalled file could be unlocked through scientific advances and modern investigative methods. The report clearly analyzed that in 2003, the investigation stalled due to 3 key factors: no body, no physical evidence at the vehicle scene, and inability to precisely locate the site shown in photos or witness statements. At the time, investigators lacked GIS tools for terrain analysis, CM technology for microscopic mineral examination, and sufficiently accurate light simulation methods to determine the photo's time. Combined with Evans' misleading statements, overlooked soil samples, and the undeveloped film rolls stored for over a decade, the clues were never connected into a logical chain. The report stated plainly, the case did not lack data. The case lacked the tools to read the data. When the file was reopened in 2015, technology led the way. CM enabled soil mineral analysis and proved Evans' presence at the Sandhills, something impossible to determine in 2003. GIS and 3D modeling pinpointed the coordinates in the film photos, opening entirely new search directions. Light simulation and astronomical data precisely reconstructed the photo's capture time, matching Evans' 2-hour gap. A timeline model based on historical traffic data and gas station receipts provided a detailed movement picture that 2003 could not recreate. The BOE played a crucial role by analyzing Evans' behavior across 6 independent statements, reinforcing that taking Mara to the Sandhills was not coincidental, but a repeated pattern. As a result, old evidence fragments, once merely disconnected pieces, were reassembled into a logical structure: photos, soil, light, terrain, journey, behavior statements. The concluding report evaluated this as a model for cold case reinvestigation, where each new technology illuminated a completely different aspect of the case. The case was described as clear proof of the importance of long-term evidence management. The 2003 film roll, once considered worthless, became the pivotal evidence leading to resolution. Soil samples stored for decades turned into the most critical physical link connecting the suspect to the scene. The Sandhills map found at Evans' home enabled comparison with new statements and expanded analysis scope. The report also assessed systemic impact. Following this case, the Nebraska Cold Case Unit conducted a comprehensive review of old evidence from all unresolved missing persons cases, especially soil samples, film photos, and low-priority items, to determine if SAM, GIS, and light simulation could be reapplied. They also improved evidence storage procedures to new standards to prevent overlooking valuable data as technology advances. Law enforcement agencies statewide were directed to update investigative methods, combining behavioral analysis and scientific techniques, as the Mara Ellison case proved that crimes involving movement and concealment of victims in vast rural areas can be solved through the intersection of multiple technical fields. Ultimately, the file was closed with the conclusion that the case could not have been solved, relying solely on 2003 methods. It was the development of technology and the persistence of the cold case unit that reconnected every piece. The summary ended with a note from Sergeant Leon Kearns. What brought the case to its conclusion was not a single clue, but the ability to reread what had been overlooked. Technology gave us light, and persistence retraced the victim's path. The case was closed in the Nebraska system as a model operational success for future cold case investigations. The story of the Mara Ellison case, from her 2003 disappearance to its resolution in 2015, reflects an important reality in contemporary American society. Not every danger appears as an overt threat. Sometimes it is disguised as opportunity, trust, or an apparently harmless offer. Mara left the Nebraska State Fairgrounds with a middle-aged photographer she believed could help build her portfolio. This detail reminds us that community settings, familiar environments, or seemingly safe situations can still harbor risks if caution or supervision is lacking. From the 2003 investigation stalling due to missing technology to the 2015 cold case unit using GIS, SAM, and light simulation to unlock old evidence, the story underscores the importance of data storage, evidence preservation, and never abandoning the search for truth, even when hope seems lost. In modern American life, where technology advances rapidly, this lesson highlights that what we do today, from how we store personal information, monitor children's social media use, to staying vigilant in everyday interactions, can become decisive factors when risks arise. Evan Halberg's concealment of the truth for 12 years also reminds us that perpetrators are not always visibly dangerous. Sometimes they appear polite, friendly, and active in ordinary communities. Therefore, skills in recognizing safety boundaries, informing others of travel plans, going with friends to unfamiliar events, or sharing details about people met are essential. Ultimately, the resolution process highlights the role of the community. The three female witnesses from 2003, Jenna, Kayla, and Lacey, helped reconstruct Evan's behavioral pattern. In American life today, vigilance, information sharing, and mutual support remain the foundation for preventing and addressing hidden risks. Thank you for following this 12-year journey to solve the case. If you found the story helpful, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next true crime analyses. See you in the next video, where we'll continue exploring how justice can be reclaimed even after a very long time has passed.